You walk into a room and, well, before you've even taken off your coat, you know exactly who is secretly annoyed, who is carrying tension in their shoulders, and who is on the verge of checking out completely. You know this, but you never actually asked. You just, felt it. I mean, you literally scan the micro expressions, the subtle shifts in posture, the slight changes in breathing patterns. It's like you have this invisible emotional radar strapped to your chest. And honestly, it's completely exhausting. You are constantly reading the room, absorbing everyone's emotional state as if it's your personal responsibility to manage it. But why? Why can't you just exist in a physical space without analyzing every single inch of it? Well, the truth is, this isn't just some quirky personality trait. It's not just you being a highly sensitive person or a gifted empath, though people might casually label it that way to make it sound poetic. What you're experiencing is actually a deeply ingrained psychological survival mechanism known as hypervigilance. Basically, your brain is operating on a constantly looping background program that screams, "Is it safe here? Are we okay?" And to figure that out, it obsessively gathers emotional data. I mean, think about it. If you can predict a storm before it hits, you can find shelter. That's exactly what your nervous system is trying to do. It's reading the emotional weather of the room so you don't get caught in the rain. But to really understand this, we have to look back, way back. Hypervigilance doesn't just spontaneously appear out of nowhere on a random Tuesday. It is almost always a learned behavior, usually forged in environments where the emotional climate was, frankly, completely unpredictable. Maybe you grew up in a household where a parent's mood could pivot in a split second. 1 minute, everything is perfectly fine, and the next, well, there's yelling, or worse, that heavy, suffocating silent treatment. You know the exact kind I'm talking about. So, as a kid, you learned that paying attention to the subtle shifts, the heavy footsteps, the sigh from the kitchen, the way a door was closed, was essentially your absolute best defense. You see, a child in an unpredictable environment quickly realizes that their safety, whether physical or emotional, depends entirely on their ability to anticipate the adults around them. If dad comes home slamming the car door, you know to stay in your room. If mom is aggressively scrubbing the dishes, well, you know to go do your homework without being asked. I mean, you became an expert emotional meteorologist because you absolutely had to. Your developing brain actually wired itself to prioritize threat detection over relaxation. And the tricky thing is, your brain doesn't just unwire itself when you move out or grow up. It basically looks at this hyper-attuned state and says, "Hey, this kept us alive. Let's just keep doing it." And that's exactly where the sheer exhaustion comes in. Fast forward to your adult life. You are sitting in a perfectly normal staff meeting, or maybe you're just at a dinner party with friends. Consciously, you know you are safe. There is no actual physical threat. But subconsciously, well, your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, is working overtime. It is processing a staggering amount of sensory information. It notices that your boss just slightly furrowed her brow when your coworker started speaking. It notices that your friend across the table hasn't touched his drink in 20 minutes. It's like having 50 browser tabs open in your mind, and every single one of them is auto-playing a different loud video, you know? Of course you're exhausted. I mean, who wouldn't be? While other people are just casually sitting there, enjoying the appetizers or taking notes, you are running a complex psychological algorithm to determine the underlying emotional frequency of the entire room. You are burning massive amounts of cognitive and emotional energy. And the wildest part is, you usually don't even realize you're doing it until you suddenly hit a wall of absolute fatigue. You leave a social event that should have been fun, and you just feel entirely depleted, like you need to sleep for 3 days straight, just to recover from the sheer effort of existing around other humans. It's just fundamentally draining on every possible level. This constant scanning creates a heavy burden because it's deeply tied to this grand illusion of control. Somewhere along the line, you sort of convinced yourself that if you can just anticipate everyone's feelings, you can manage the outcome. If you notice your partner getting stressed, you can immediately smooth things over, crack a joke, or shrink yourself down so you don't add to their burden. Basically, you are taking on the emotional weight of everyone around you. But here is the hard truth. You cannot control other people's emotions. No matter how perfectly you read the room, no matter how carefully you walk on eggshells, you are not the ultimate architect of someone else's internal state. And I think, that realization is actually terrifying for a hypervigilant brain. Because if we aren't in control of the emotional environment, then we are vulnerable. And to a traumatized or chronically stressed nervous system, vulnerability feels incredibly dangerous. So, instead of letting our guard down, we double down. We scan harder, we read deeper into innocuous text messages, we analyze the specific punctuation someone used, or the exact tone of their voice when they said, "hello." We convince ourselves that this exhausting level of awareness is actually our superpower. And sure, it makes you highly empathetic. People probably praise you for being such a great listener, or being so deeply intuitive. But at what cost? I mean, really, let's be entirely honest about the cost here. When you are hyper-focused on everyone else's internal world, you become completely disconnected from your own. You become a social chameleon, constantly shifting your personality, your boundaries, and your needs to accommodate the energy of the room. If the room is tense, you become the peacemaker. If the room is sad, you become the cheerleader. But who are you when the room is entirely empty? Often, people who chronically read the room struggle to answer that basic question because when there is no one left to monitor, the silence can actually feel deafening. You finally have to sit with your own feelings, and that can be incredibly uncomfortable. It's a bizarre paradox, really. We desperately crave peace and relaxation, but when we finally get a moment of it, our nervous system totally panics. It's like, wait, why is it so quiet? What am I missing? What disaster is looming right around the corner? So, we subconsciously seek out chaos, or we obsessively ruminate on past interactions, just to give our hypervigilant engine something to chew on. We replay conversations, wondering, did I say the wrong thing? Did they look annoyed when I left? We are literally manufacturing threats in our own minds because the absence of a threat feels profoundly unnatural to a brain that is fundamentally addicted to survival mode. Physiologically, this takes a massive, undeniable toll on the body. You aren't just tired, your cortisol levels are chronically elevated. Your sympathetic nervous system is stuck in the fight or flight gear. Over time, this leads to very real physical symptoms. Things like tension headaches, tight shoulders, chronic digestive issues, and a significantly compromised immune system. You might clench your jaw at night or struggle with relentless insomnia because your brain absolutely refuses to power down. You are basically asking your body to sprint a marathon every single day and then wondering why you feel like you've been hit by a truck by Friday afternoon. It's not a character flaw, it's literally biological burnout. So, naturally, the biggest question that comes up once you realize you are doing all of this is, Well, how do you actually stop? I mean, it's one thing to logically understand why you are constantly scanning the room for emotional landmines, but it is a completely different beast to actually, turn off that deeply ingrained emotional radar. You really can't just snap your fingers one day and tell your nervous system, hey, we are safe now. You can totally shut down the survival mode. It just fundamentally doesn't work like that. Your brain has spent years, maybe even decades, convincing itself that this hypervigilance is the exact thing keeping you alive. So, telling it to suddenly relax is like telling a bodyguard to just go take a nap while the VIP walks down a dark, dangerous alley. Your mind is going to completely resist it. But there is hope, and it starts with a very slow, very intentional process of rewiring how you interact with the world. The first real, tangible step in breaking this exhausting cycle is recognizing the profound difference between empathy and emotional enmeshment. Empathy is like a beautiful thing. It is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another human being in a healthy way. But enmeshment, well, that is a completely different story. Enmeshment is when the boundary between where you end and where someone else begins just entirely completely vanishes. You see your friend looking slightly annoyed, and suddenly their annoyance becomes your absolute emergency. You absorb it. You essentially decide that it is your personal moral responsibility to fix it. So, the practice here is learning to observe without absorbing. It's like looking at a fire in a fireplace. You can appreciate the heat. You can see that it's burning, but you don't actually have to jump inside the flames just to prove you see it. And honestly, this leads us to the hardest part of the entire recovery process, learning to tolerate the extreme discomfort of not fixing things. I mean, let's paint a picture here. Imagine you are sitting in a room and you can absolutely feel that the energy is slightly off. Maybe two co-workers just had a weird interaction, or maybe your partner is quietly stressing over a text message. Your immediate, almost violently strong instinct is going to be to jump in, crack a joke, smooth the edges, and meticulously manage the vibe back to a state of calm. But what if you just didn't? What if you just sat there, physically grounding your feet into the floor and allowed the room to just be uncomfortable? The first time you try this, your brain is going to absolutely scream at you. You will feel this intense, buzzing anxiety in your chest, convinced that by not intervening, you are somehow dropping the ball and failing. But sitting in that discomfort and realizing the world didn't actually end just because someone else was unhappy is literally the only way to teach your nervous system that you don't have to be the emotional janitor of every room you walk into. Because here is the absolute truth that hypervigilant people really struggle to accept. People are actually allowed to be in bad moods. I know, it sounds crazy, right? But it's totally true. People are allowed to be frustrated, or sad, or just generally annoyed, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you. When you obsessively try to fix everyone's emotional state, you are actually, in a weird way, robbing them of their right to just feel their own feelings. You are unconsciously making their internal experience about your own desperate need for safety. And when you finally internalize the fact that someone else's bad mood is not a personal indictment of your worth, nor is it an impending threat to your physical safety, you start to feel this incredible, almost overwhelming sense of freedom. You can just let them be mad. You can just, go read a book or sip your coffee while they process their own emotional weather. Of course, to do this, you have to get out of your head and back into your physical body. When you are hypervigilant, your energy is completely externalized. It's like all of your sensory sensory organs are reaching outward, hovering around the perimeter of the room, like little drones gathering intelligence. So you have to consciously practice calling your energy back home. Somatic therapists talk about this all the time. It's the practice of literally shifting your focus from the external environment to your own internal physical sensations. When you feel that urge to scan the room, you interrupt the pattern. You ask yourself, wait, how does my actual body feel right now? Not how the room feels, but how you feel. Are your shoulders basically touching your ears? Is your jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth? Are you even taking full breaths, or are you just shallowly sipping air? By forcing your brain to focus on your physical self, you are pulling the emergency brake on that runaway train of external scanning. And this is where the amazing science of neuroplasticity really comes into play. Your brain is essentially like a dense, overgrown forest. For years, you have been walking down the exact same path, the path of hypervigilance, anxiety, and emotional scanning. Because you've walked it a million times, that path is wide, clear, and incredibly easy to travel down. Your brain basically defaults to it automatically because it requires no effort. Choosing to not read the room, choosing to stay grounded in your own body, well, that is like trying to hack your way through thick, stubborn bushes to create a brand new trail. It is going to be slow. It is going to be exhausting at first. You will probably get tripped up and fall back onto the old path quite a few times, but every single time you consciously choose to let a room be tense without fixing it, you are clearing a little more of that new path. And eventually, over time, the new path becomes the default route. Your brain literally rewires its structural connections to prioritize your own peace over the room's emotional climate. But, we really have to address the guilt because it is definitely going to show up. When you stop managing everyone else's emotions, you are probably going to feel incredibly selfish. You have likely built a large part of your core identity around being the good, intuitive, caring person who always knows exactly what everyone needs before they even ask. People might have even heavily praised you for it. So, when you stop doing that heavy emotional labor, some people in your life might actually get confused or even a little offended. They might feel like you are suddenly pulling away or being cold, but you have to remember that setting emotional boundaries is not a malicious act. You aren't punishing anyone by refusing to absorb their stress. You are simply preserving your own life force. And honestly, anyone who requires you to completely drain yourself just to make them feel comfortable is probably someone you need to reevaluate your proximity to anyway. You also have to prepare yourself for the grief that almost always accompanies this kind of deep psychological healing. Yes, real grief, because once you finally start dropping the emotional radar and you begin to actually feel calm, you might suddenly realize just how much of your life, your precious energy, and your sheer potential was entirely consumed by survival mode. You might feel deeply sad for the younger version of you who had to work so impossibly hard just to feel safe in their own home. You might mourn the fact that you spent so many years completely exhausted for no good reason. And you know what? That is completely okay. Let yourself feel that sadness. Let yourself deeply acknowledge the profound unfairness of having to be an adult when you were just a kid. But then, let that grief gently transition into a deep, unwavering self-compassion. You did what you had to do. Your brain was just trying to protect you the very best way it knew how. And as you continue to practice this, something deeply fundamental begins to shift within your actual identity. For so long, your sense of self was probably entirely tangled up in being the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the human barometer of the spaces you occupied. You probably thought your immense value as a human being was directly tied to how useful you could be in managing the emotional chaos of others. But when you strip all of that away, you are suddenly left with this beautifully blank canvas. Who are you when you are not desperately trying to anticipate the needs of your boss, your partner, or your friends? Well, you actually get to figure that out now. You get to discover what you genuinely enjoy doing when you aren't doing it just to match someone else's energy. You might find that you actually have very different opinions, tastes, and desires than you previously thought, simply because you are finally listening to your own internal voice instead of the incredibly loud, demanding voices of the room around you. This isn't just about stopping a bad habit. It is quite literally about meeting yourself for the very first time. So, the next time you walk into a room, whether it's a crowded, noisy party, a tense corporate boardroom, or just your own quiet living room, I want you to try a little experiment. Before you even cross the threshold, I want you to take one massive, deliberate, deep breath. Feel your feet resting securely inside your shoes. Feel the physical weight of your own body taking up space in the world. And when you walk in, make a conscious, intentional choice not to scan. Let your eyes softly focus on a neutral object, like a plant or a painting, rather than immediately locking onto people's facial expressions. If you feel the magnetic pull to check the emotional temperature, just gently, firmly pull your attention back to your own breath. I mean, it is going to feel so incredibly foreign, maybe even a bit reckless, to just walk into a space and simply exist in it without calculating the emotional math. But as you stand there, grounded in your own physical reality, you will slowly start to realize something absolutely beautiful. The room is not going to collapse. The people around you are going to survive their own moods without your intervention. And most importantly, you are entirely safe. You don't have to be the emotional anchor for the entire world anymore. You can just, be the anchor for yourself. You can finally lay down the radar, take off the heavy armor you've been wearing since childhood, and just experience the absolute, profound relief of being quietly, peacefully unbothered. It is a long, complicated journey to get there, but I promise you, the quiet on the other side is absolutely worth every single step. You pride yourself on not needing anyone. You're the one who fixes everything. You don't ever ask for favors, and you certainly don't beg for attention. But honestly, here's the psychological truth. Your fierce, untouchable independence is actually a mask. And underneath it, you probably crave external validation just as much, if not substantially more, than the people you secretly judge for being, quote unquote, needy. Welcome to the echo chamber of the mind. Today, we are going to dive really, really deep into the psychology of why highly independent people secretly and sometimes desperately need external validation. I mean, we currently live in a society that practically worships the lone wolf. You know the exact type I'm talking about. The self-made hustler, the person who never ever asks for help, the one who claims they are entirely self-sufficient. We applaud that, right? But clinical psychology tells a very, very different story about what is actually going on behind closed doors. So let's just kind of unpack this whole phenomenon, because it's absolutely fascinating, and it might just change the way you look at yourself, or maybe someone you love. To really understand this, we first have to look at where this extreme brand of hyper-independence actually comes from. I mean, think about it. Nobody is just born wanting to do everything completely alone in the dark. As human beings, we are, literally, biologically wired for connection and community. So, when someone develops this rigid, almost aggressively defensive self-reliance, it usually isn't just a quirky, fun personality trait. It's actually, more often than not, a trauma response. Psychologists frequently refer to this specific behavior as counterdependency. Basically, somewhere along the line, usually in early childhood, or maybe during a really formative, painful past relationship, relying on someone else was proven to be dangerous, or perhaps it was just deeply, consistently disappointing. You basically learned that if you wanted something done right, or if you just wanted to feel physically and emotionally safe, you absolutely had to do it yourself. Well, fast forward to your adulthood, and you're this incredibly capable, seemingly bulletproof person. People look at you and they think, wow, they really have it all together. I wish I was half that strong. But what they simply don't see is the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion that comes attached to that strength. Because honestly, constantly acting as your own entire emotional and physical support system is incredibly draining on your nervous system. Now, here is where the psychological paradox really kicks into high gear. You see, even though you've successfully built this impenetrable fortress around yourself, you can't actually outsmart basic human nature. Take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for instance. That famous pyramid from Psych 101. It very clearly places the need for belonging and esteem right there in the middle of human development. We fundamentally need to be seen, recognized, and valued by our tribe to feel secure. So, what exactly happens when a highly independent person rigidly denies that deeply ingrained need? Well, the need doesn't just magically disappear into thin air. It literally just goes underground. It goes entirely subconscious. You stop asking for validation directly because, well, asking feels vulnerable, and to a hyper-independent brain, vulnerability feels like a life-threatening weakness. Instead, you sort of subconsciously construct these incredibly elaborate workarounds. You figure out how to get that validation without ever having to explicitly admit that you need it. You become the chronic overachiever. You become the person who constantly anticipates everyone else's needs before they even voice them. You essentially make yourself, honestly, completely indispensable at work, in friendships, and in romantic relationships. Why? Because if you are indispensable, people are essentially forced to praise you. They will validate your worth, and you finally get that desperately needed dopamine hit, that psychological reassurance, without ever having to say out loud, hey, I really need someone to tell me I'm doing a good job right now. This naturally brings us to the core concept of the actual echo chamber of the mind. When you are fiercely independent, your mind basically becomes an isolated, soundproof room. You are constantly bouncing your ideas, your deepest anxieties, your greatest successes, and your worst failures off your own internal walls with absolutely no outside input. And, at first glance, that sounds kind of empowering. You're the undisputed master of your own destiny, right? You don't need anyone's permission or approval, but the hidden toxic problem with an echo chamber is that it severely distorts your perception of reality. When you achieve something truly great, your internal voice says, "Good job." But because it's just you talking to yourself, that voice quickly starts to ring a bit hollow. It's just you validating you. There's no external anchor to ground that success in the shared reality of the real world. It feels a bit like cheating, sort of. And conversely, when you fail, or even just make a tiny, completely human mistake, that same echo chamber amplifies your self-criticism to an absolutely deafening roar. Without a trusted external voice to step in, gently interrupt the spiral and say, "Hey, it's really not that bad. You're only human." You are left to basically consume yourself alive with your own magnified doubts. This right here is exactly why highly independent people so frequently suffer from crippling imposter syndrome. They are literally starving for an objective, outside perspective to balance the heavily skewed scales inside their own heads. If we examine this through the lens of attachment theory, the picture becomes even clearer. I mean, if you're at all into psychology, you've probably heard of attachment styles by now, right? It's basically the framework of how we learn to relate to others based on our early relationships with caregivers. Highly independent people very often lean towards what is clinically known as a dismissive avoidant attachment style. Now, someone with this specific style has learned to completely suppress their innate attachment system. They act as though intimate relationships are, well, somewhat optional or even entirely burdensome. But the irony, and this is heavily backed by physiological research, is that their bodies are actually experiencing intense stress when they are disconnected. In various laboratory studies, when avoidant individuals are asked to discuss their relationships or the potential for rejection, they might verbally state that they don't care at all. They look completely unbothered, totally cool on the outside, but if you hook them up to a heart rate monitor or check their cortisol levels, their bodies are literally in a state of high alert. I mean, their physiological response completely betrays their calm exterior. They are subconsciously craving connection and the safety of external reassurance, even as their conscious mind works overtime to push everyone away. It is this massive, exhausting internal tug of war between the mind aggressively saying, "I don't need anyone," and the body quietly screaming, "Please tell me I am safe and valued." And, we really can't talk about this psychological dynamic without bringing up the classic trope of the strong friend. I mean, you probably know exactly who I'm talking about here. Or, well, maybe you actually are this person in your own social circle. The strong friend is the one everyone goes to for advice, for a shoulder to cry on, or to fix a crisis. They project this aura of absolute competence. But being the strong friend is, honestly, an incredibly lonely island to live on. Because you are constantly pouring from your own cup to fill others, people just sort of naturally assume your cup is magically, endlessly full. They don't check in on you. They don't offer you the validation you secretly need because you've basically trained them to believe you don't require it. You have conditioned the people around you to see you as a pillar of stone rather than a living, breathing human being who occasionally needs to be held up too. And so, the resentment slowly starts to build. You sit there, completely drained, silently wondering why no one is noticing your quiet struggles. But the harsh, psychological reality is that people cannot read your mind. If you constantly project the image that you are an impenetrable fortress, people are simply not going to try to storm the gates with comfort or validation. They will just admire the walls from afar. So, how does this deeply buried, secret need for validation actually manifest in your normal, day-to-day life? Well, it's usually incredibly subtle, almost completely invisible if you don't know exactly what to look for. It's the way you might just casually mention to a co-worker how little sleep you got last night, or how incredibly busy and stacked your schedule is this week. I mean, you're not whining or complaining, right? You're just stating the objective facts of your life. But underneath that very casual throwaway delivery, there is often a very quiet, almost desperate plea for someone to actually notice how hard you are working, to pause and say, "Wow, you are carrying so much right now. I see you, and you're doing amazing." It's also extremely present in the way you might constantly over-deliver on a basic project. You are handed a standard, straightforward task, and you don't just meet the baseline expectations, you absolutely obliterate them. You put in 10 times the effort required because, on some deep subconscious level, you kind of desperately need that jaw-dropping, awe-struck reaction from others. That specific reaction of amazement is the premium fuel that keeps the heavy, clunky engine of your independence running. Because honestly, if nobody ever stops to notice and validate how incredibly well you are surviving all on your own, then what is the actual point of being this impossibly strong all the time? So, when we really look at this relentless, exhausting cycle, we have to talk about the absolute, inevitable wall that every single hyper-independent person eventually hits. I mean, you can only run your engine in the red for so long before it just completely gives out, right? In psychology, we sometimes refer to this as the breaking point of the echo chamber, or, more commonly, severe emotional and physical burnout. It's that terrifying, undeniable moment when the sheer, crushing weight of carrying everything all by yourself finally outweighs the psychological safety that your isolation provides. You see, when you rely solely on yourself for every single logistical, emotional, and physical need, your nervous system is essentially stuck in a prolonged, low-grade fight-or-flight state. You are, basically, always bracing for an impact that you fully believe no one else is going to help you absorb. And the really crazy thing is, when the burnout finally hits, it rarely looks like a dramatic, movie-style breakdown with sobbing and screaming. Honestly, it usually looks like profound, heavy apathy. You just sort of wake up one day, and the things that used to give you that much needed dopamine hit, the overachieving, the problem-solving for your friends, the relentless hustling, they just feel completely meaningless. You become so deeply starved for genuine, unconditional external validation, the kind that absolutely doesn't require you to perform a miracle to earn it, that your brain basically just goes on an indefinite strike. This naturally brings us to what is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire psychological dynamic, and that is how it completely wreaks havoc on your romantic relationships. I mean, really think about it for a second. If you have been deeply conditioned to believe that you absolutely do not need anyone, how on earth do you successfully merge your life with a romantic partner? Well, the short, honest answer is, with extreme difficulty. Highly independent people usually attract partners who are either incredibly nurturing, almost to a fault, or partners who are perfectly happy to sit back and let you do all the heavy lifting. But here is exactly where the subconscious sabotage kicks in. When a healthy partner actually tries to step up and offer the validation, the praise, and the support that you secretly, desperately crave, your internal alarm bells instantly start ringing. I mean, it literally triggers your counterdependency trauma response. You might start picking unnecessary fights, or suddenly finding completely irrational flaws in the person, or just emotionally shutting down entirely. Why? Because accepting their validation requires you to explicitly admit that you actually need it, and that simple admission completely shatters the protective illusion of your self-sufficiency. You essentially push away the exact thing you are dying for because the vulnerability required to accept it feels, well, psychologically fatal. It's an incredibly tragic, frustrating cycle where you isolate yourself to feel safe and then secretly resent your partner for not breaking through the walls you aggressively built to keep them out. And underneath all of this relationship sabotage and chronic burnout is a deeply entrenched, profoundly toxic core belief, the absolute terrifying fear of being a burden. I mean, this is the real ghost haunting the echo chamber of your mind. If you really sit down and interrogate a fiercely independent person, like truly get past the tough, hyper-competent exterior, you will almost always find this deeply rooted conviction that their needs are somehow just too much for other people to handle. You know, you probably learned somewhere along the way that having basic human needs caused stress for your caregivers, or maybe it drove a massive wedge in a highly formative past relationship, so you internalized this incredibly damaging narrative that being lovable means being utterly zero maintenance. You convince yourself that the only guaranteed way to ensure people stay in your life is to never, ever require anything from them. But honestly, clinical psychology tells us that is a complete distortion of how human bonding actually works. Real, deep intimacy is actually built on a foundation of mutual need. When you aggressively refuse to let anyone help you, or when you completely reject their sincere attempts to validate and support you, you are basically robbing them of the opportunity to love you in a tangible, meaningful way. You are effectively locking them out of the most human part of your experience, all while secretly, desperately hoping they will somehow find a master key. So, how do we actually fix this? How does a person who has spent their entire adult life building this impenetrable fortress step outside of it without feeling completely exposed and terrified? Well, modern psychology points us toward a very specific, incredibly powerful concept, and it's called interdependence. Now, it is really, really important to understand that interdependence is not the same thing as codependence. I mean, codependence is basically losing your entire identity in someone else and completely relying on them to regulate your own emotions, which is exactly what highly independent people are so deeply afraid of. But interdependence, that is the absolute sweet spot. It's the healthy, mature middle ground of human connection. Basically, it means recognizing that you are a fully capable, completely whole individual, but also consciously acknowledging that your life is vastly richer, safer, and infinitely more manageable when you actively allow others to contribute to it. It's the profound realization that needing validation or asking for help doesn't actually diminish your strength, it actually contextualizes it. Interdependence is about leaving the heavy steel door to your echo chamber open just a crack so that a trusted, objective voice can occasionally drift in and ground you in reality. It's about understanding that letting someone else carry the grocery bags or asking a friend for advice isn't a failure of your fierce independence, but rather a beautiful triumph of your shared humanity. But I have to be completely, brutally honest with you here. Making this psychological transition is absolutely not going to be comfortable. In fact, when you first start attempting to dismantle your hyper-independence, you are almost guaranteed to experience something therapists lovingly refer to as a vulnerability hangover. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's that awful, sinking, completely dreadful feeling in the pit of your stomach the morning after you finally open up to someone, or the massive wave of anxiety that completely washes over you after you ask for a favor for the very first time. Your brain, which has spent years meticulously protecting you through isolation, will absolutely go into overdrive. It will loudly tell you that you made a huge mistake, that you overshared, that you look incredibly weak, and that the person is definitely going to use your vulnerability against you at some point. This is literally the echo chamber fighting for its life. I mean, your inner critic will be screaming at you to rebuild the walls immediately, but the crucial, non-negotiable step here is to literally just sit with that intense discomfort. You have to ride out the vulnerability hangover without retreating back into your fortress. You have to actively wait and see that the sky doesn't actually fall just because you admitted you needed a little bit of help. Over time, as you repeatedly survive these tiny moments of exposure, your nervous system actually begins to recalibrate. You slowly learn that external validation isn't a dangerous trap, but rather a completely normal, deeply sustaining part of the human experience. To actually begin breaking this deeply ingrained cycle in your everyday life, you really have to start ridiculously small. I mean, please do not try to completely overhaul your entire personality overnight, because that is a surefire recipe for a massive, full-body panic response. Instead, just start by identifying one tiny, almost entirely inconsequential area where you can relinquish a little bit of control. Maybe you actually let your coworker take the lead on a minor low-stakes presentation. Or, maybe you finally let your partner pick the restaurant for date night without secretly second-guessing their choice the entire drive there. When someone actually offers you a genuine compliment, instead of immediately deflecting it, minimizing it, or explaining exactly why you don't deserve it, just try forcing yourself to say two simple words. Thank you. Just let the external validation actually land. Let it sink in, even if it feels incredibly awkward, unearned, and foreign at first. And when you are genuinely struggling, try testing the waters with a safe, trusted friend. You absolutely don't have to spill your deepest, darkest childhood traumas right out of the gate. Just try looking at them and saying, honestly, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed today. That's it. That is the entire exercise. By consistently taking these tiny, calculated emotional risks, you are slowly drilling microscopic holes into the thick walls of your echo chamber, allowing just enough light and sound in to prove to your frightened inner child that it is finally safe to step outside. Because at the end of the day, your fierce, unwavering independence is a deeply beautiful, incredibly powerful trait. It has undoubtedly kept you safe during hard times. It has driven your most impressive successes, and it has made you into the remarkably capable, resilient person you are right now. But it absolutely shouldn't have to be a life sentence of emotional solitary confinement. You honestly deserve to be recognized, to be held up when you are exhausted, and to warmly receive the very same validation that you so freely and effortlessly give to everyone else around you. Escaping the lonely echo chamber of your mind doesn't mean that you lose your unique strength. It simply means that you stop forcing yourself to be strong all by yourself. So, the next time you find yourself aggressively insisting that you've got it all handled and you don't need a single soul, maybe just take a deep breath, pause for a second, and ask yourself, am I actually okay right now, or am I just completely terrified to admit that I need someone? Thank you so much for diving deep into the psychology of independence with me today. If this really resonated with you, or if it immediately made you think of that one endlessly strong friend in your life, go ahead and share it with them. Let them know you finally see them. Take care of yourselves, and remember, it's actually okay to be human. Have you ever noticed how some people can just effortlessly shrug off a terrible argument or a really harsh comment, like they have a massive relationship-ending style blowout, and then literally 2 hours later, they're casually asking what you want for dinner? Meanwhile, you're sitting there, your heart is still actively racing, your stomach is tied in actual physical knots, and you feel the exact same intense sting of anger, or sadness, or shame as you did the very second the argument started. Well, honestly, it's not because you're emotionally weak, and it's definitely not because you're just, being petty or holding a grudge. It is actually a deeply rooted, documented psychological phenomenon. We are talking about the heavy, often misunderstood burden of emotional permanence, or rather, the intense, lingering grip of emotional memory, and exactly why you quite literally cannot just get over things the way other people seem to do so easily. So let's just dive right into the reality of it. When psychologists talk about the concept of emotional permanence, they're usually referring to the developmental ability to feel secure in a connection even when you're not physically with that person, like knowing your partner still loves you even if they haven't texted you in a few hours. But there is this really challenging flip side to it, especially when we start talking about emotional memory and emotional regulation. For a lot of people, particularly those who might be dealing with ADHD, autism, or complex trauma histories, emotions don't just, politely fade into the background once an event is over. They don't become a distant, fuzzy memory. Instead, the emotion stays perfectly, almost painfully, preserved. It's almost like a mental photograph that simply refuses to fade no matter how many years pass. You don't just objectively remember that you were sad or embarrassed. You actually feel the sadness all over again in your body, as if the event is happening right now, in this exact second. It's entirely exhausting, frankly. To really understand why this happens, we have to look closely at, the brain. Specifically, we need to look at the relationship between the amygdala and the hippocampus. You can think of your hippocampus as kind of like the brain's incredibly organized filing cabinet for facts and events, right? It logs what happened, where it happened, and who was in the room. Your amygdala, on the other hand, is the emotional center. It's your internal smoke detector and alarm system for someone who can just naturally get over it. These two parts of the brain work together incredibly smoothly. The amygdala sounds the alarm when something bad happens, the event finishes, and then the hippocampus calmly files that memory away into the past folder. The alarm turns off, but for someone struggling with this burden of permanent, intense emotional memory, it's like the file never gets put away. The amygdala just stays continuously activated. Every single time you recall the event, your brain essentially tricks your nervous system into believing the threat or the intense emotional pain is currently active all over again. And really think about what that actually does to a person's body over time. It's not just a purely mental exercise or a flaw in your philosophy. When your brain is constantly pulling up these incredibly vivid, high-stakes emotional states, your central nervous system is continuously taking a massive hit. You get that sudden rush of cortisol, that sharp spike in adrenaline. Your chest visibly tightens. It's literally a physical burden that you have to carry around. You know when someone carelessly says, "Oh, come on, it's all in your head." Well, technically, yes, the spark originates in your brain, but the cascading physical response is entirely, undeniably real. You are essentially carrying around an invisible, incredibly heavy backpack filled to the brim with every unresolved emotion, every sharp word spoken to you, every embarrassing social mistake you've ever made. And while other people can casually take their backpacks off and put them down at the end of the day, yours is somehow permanently strapped to your shoulders. It makes just navigating normal, everyday life feel like a steep uphill climb, doesn't it? Then, of course, there is the social aspect of all this, which is honestly where the real quiet pain usually lies. Because, let's be entirely honest with ourselves, society deeply values resilience. Or at least, society has a very specific, rigid definition of what resilience is supposed to look like. We are constantly fed this cultural narrative that moving on quickly and never looking back is the ultimate, undeniable sign of mental strength. We hear cliche things like, time heals all wounds, or you just need to let it go and be the bigger person. And when you literally, biologically cannot do that, when your brain absolutely refuses to just drop the file and let it go, you inevitably start to feel like there is something fundamentally, irreversibly broken inside of you. You watch your friends or family bounce back from major setbacks or harsh words, and you sit there thinking, why can't I just be like that? What is actually wrong with me? And then the guilt silently compounds the original emotion. You're not just sad about what originally happened anymore. You are now deeply, intensely ashamed that you are still sad about what happened. And, dealing with other people's reactions to your lingering feelings can honestly be worse than the emotion itself. When you try to openly explain to a friend or a partner that a flippant comment they made 3 weeks ago is still quietly tearing you apart inside, they usually look at you like you just grew a second head. They might instantly get defensive, right? They'll throw their hands up and say, I can't believe you're still bringing that old stuff up. Or, you're clearly just trying to start a fight with me. But you aren't. You really, genuinely aren't. You're just desperately trying to process an emotion that outright refuses to leave your nervous system. But because they have already neatly processed it and filed it away in their own brain, they perceive your lingering pain as a direct attack or as a glaring sign of emotional immaturity. This dynamic creates this massive, heartbreaking disconnect between you and the people you desperately want to love and connect with. You end up feeling incredibly isolated, basically trapped alone in your own emotional time machine while everyone else has effortlessly moved on to the present day. This actually ties into another truly fascinating, though frustrating, psychological concept, which is known as time blindness. Now, time blindness is usually talked about in relation to productivity, like people who are chronically late to work, or who just literally can't estimate how long a simple task will take them to finish. But, it definitely applies to the landscape of our emotions too. If you experience emotional time blindness, your brain doesn't really know how to differentiate between a painful emotion from 5 years ago and an emotion from 5 minutes ago. There is essentially no linear timeline in your head for feelings. There is only now. So when that specific memory gets accidentally triggered by a random song on the radio, or a certain smell, or just a wandering thought before bed, the emotion hits you with the exact same raw velocity as day one. You can't just logically talk yourself down and say, oh well, that was a long time ago, it really doesn't matter anymore, because to your nervous system, it isn't a long time ago at all. It is happening right now. It is aggressively present tense. And if we decide to add complex trauma into this whole mix, well, the situation becomes infinitely more complicated. Trauma actually fundamentally rewires the architecture of the brain to constantly look for danger, right? It makes that amygdala, that internal smoke detector, hypervigilant and highly sensitive. So, if your lack of emotional impermanence is deeply rooted in past trauma, your brain is likely holding on to these intense negative emotions as a really twisted, backward form of protection. The brain thinks, well, if I never ever forget how much this specific thing hurt, I will be alert enough to never let it happen to me again. It's basically your own biology trying to keep you safe by keeping you entirely miserable. It's a primal survival mechanism that has far outlived its usefulness in modern life, but it is incredibly difficult to just switch off. You end up getting stuck in these exhausting rumination loops, replaying the traumatic event or the argument over and over in your head, hoping to somehow find a different outcome, or trying to figure out what you did to cause it. But all you're really doing is just heavily deepening that emotional groove in your brain, making the feeling even more stubborn and permanent. So, what does carrying this heavy emotional permanence actually look like in your standard everyday life? Well, it usually means you might start actively avoiding perfectly normal social situations, not because you're genuinely antisocial or don't like people, but simply because the inherent risk of a negative interaction is just entirely too high for you to handle. You know deep down that if someone makes even a slightly critical remark about your outfit or your work, you won't be able to just brush it off over lunch. You'll be forced to carry that heavy critique with you for the next 6 months. It also means you might over-apologize constantly, absolutely terrified that you've accidentally caused someone else the exact kind of lasting emotional pain that you regularly experience yourself. You slowly become a chronic, exhausted people pleaser, frantically trying to manage and curate everyone else's emotions in the room so that you don't ever have to deal with the devastating fallout of conflict. You are basically tiptoeing through your entire life, desperately trying not to step on any hidden emotional landmines because you know with absolute certainty that if one goes off, the loud ringing in your ears isn't going to stop for a very, very long time. And all of this constant vigilance, this endless emotional buffering, leads to a profound sense of burnout that is really hard to articulate to anyone who doesn't experience it. When you feel everything forever, you don't really get to experience the luxury of a truly blank slate. You know, like you never get to just wake up and feel completely neutral. Your baseline is already cluttered with the echoes of last week's anxieties, last month's rejections, and last year's heartbreaks. So when a new stressor is introduced, even a minor one like a flat tire or a slightly rude email, your emotional capacity is already at 99%. You snap or you completely shut down, and from the outside, it looks like a massive overreaction to a tiny problem. But to you, it's just the final agonizing drop of water in a glass that has been overflowing for years. You aren't reacting to the single rude email, you are reacting to the cumulative weight of an emotional history that your brain simply refuses to let go of. Now, I mean, hearing all of this, it can feel incredibly heavy, right? If you've spent your entire life silently wondering why you just can't seem to brush things off like everyone else does, finally putting a name to it, recognizing this intense burden of emotional permanence is, honestly, a lot to process. You might be feeling profound relief and absolute exhaustion. Relief because you finally have proof that you aren't broken, but exhaustion because you're realizing your brain is quite literally wired to hold on to the heavy stuff. And, you know, the most natural instinct, once you realize this, is to try and fight it. You want to forcefully push the memories down, to yell at yourself to snap out of it, and to demand that your nervous system finally chill out. But, realistically, treating yourself with that harshness is exactly the opposite of what actually helps. See, the harder you try to forcefully suppress an emotion that your brain is actively insisting is important, the louder and more aggressive that emotion is going to get. It's exactly like trying to hold a giant beach ball underwater. Eventually, it's just going to explode right back up into your face. So, the first real step in navigating this isn't about magically fixing your brain so that you never feel lingering pain again. It's actually about practicing radical acceptance. Radical acceptance basically means that you stop fighting the reality of how your nervous system is built, When that familiar ache from a 5-year-old argument randomly hits you on a Tuesday afternoon, instead of immediately spiraling into shame and telling yourself, "I am so pathetic for still caring," you literally just say out loud, "Okay, my brain is bringing this up again. I am feeling this pain, and that makes sense because of how I'm wired." You just, let it be in the room. Because this emotional permanence is so deeply physical, because it is literally hijacking your nervous system, you honestly cannot just logic your way out of it. You can't think your way into feeling safe when your body is screaming that you are in present danger. You have to learn how to speak directly to your body in a language that it actually understands, which, is usually through somatic grounding. When you feel that intense wave of an old emotion washing over you, you have to find physical ways to forcefully anchor yourself in the literal present moment. For some people, that means grabbing something freezing cold, like holding an ice cube until the sharp sensation overrides the emotional flashback. For others, it's intense, short bursts of physical movement, like literally just shaking your arms and legs out. You are essentially, giving your physical body concrete proof that the danger is not happening right now. And this leads directly into a psychological tool that therapists call dual awareness. This is, honestly, a total game changer if you struggle with letting things go. Dual awareness is the practice of consciously holding two entirely different truths in your mind at the exact same time without letting one destroy the other. It's the ability to say, yes, a part of me is completely devastated right now about that betrayal from 3 years ago, but also another part of me is sitting safely on my couch, drinking a warm cup of coffee. It's basically reminding your brain that while the emotion is valid, it does not actually dictate your current reality. You, gently remind your amygdala that it's looking at an old photograph, not a live video feed. And I know that sounds simple in theory, but in practice, it takes a monumental amount of focus. Over time, cultivating dual awareness helps to gently pry your present identity away from the suffocating grip of that past emotional state. Managing all of this internally means that you also have to start being fiercely protective of your emotional bandwidth out there in the real world. When you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that a negative interaction is going to cost you 10 times more emotional energy than it costs the average person, you honestly have to stop putting yourself in situations that constantly bankrupt you. This might mean setting firm boundaries with people in your life who thrive on drama or who are casually critical for fun. You know the ones I mean, right? The friends who drop passive-aggressive comments disguised as jokes and expect you to laugh it off. You aren't laughing it off. You are absorbing it, and it's going to hurt for weeks. So you have to give yourself permission to step away from those dynamics and stop feeling guilty for stepping away. It is not selfish to walk away from a relationship that repeatedly haunts your nervous system. But what about the people you actually want to keep in your life? The partners or family members who genuinely love you, but fundamentally do not understand why you can't just get over an argument. Honestly, this is where you have to change the way you communicate about your feelings. Instead of expecting them to magically understand your internal landscape, you have to give them the blueprint. When you get into a disagreement with a partner and they are ready to move on, but your body is still vibrating with adrenaline, you have to be brave enough to say, "Hey, logically, I know this argument is resolved, but my nervous system is still deeply stuck in the conflict. I need a little bit of time for my physical body to catch up." Giving it that biological framing takes the blame away. It stops them from feeling attacked, and it helps them understand that you aren't holding a grudge. Your body is just processing the data much slower. And I really want to make sure we talk about the flip side of this because it almost always gets overlooked. We spend so much time focusing on the burden of emotional permanence, the heavy weight of carrying around all of this pain. But, you have to remember that this exact same biological wiring applies to all the good things too. People who experience emotions this deeply are quite often some of the most profoundly empathetic, creative, and connected humans on the planet. Because you know exactly what it feels like to hurt, you instinctively become a safe haven for other people. When you love someone, you love them with an intensity that is fiercely loyal. When you experience a moment of pure joy, that feeling gets burned into your brain just as permanently as the pain does. You have this incredible capacity to recall a beautiful memory from 10 years ago and feel the exact same rush of warmth and happiness all over again. So, yes, feeling everything forever is incredibly exhausting. It means you have to work twice as hard to calm your nervous system in a world that constantly tells you to just rush forward. But honestly, it also means that your emotional landscape is incredibly rich. You do not love in halves. You experience the full, beautiful spectrum of the human experience in high definition. You are not broken because you remember how things felt. You are not weak because it takes you a little bit longer to put the heavy backpack down. You are simply processing the world with a depth that society hasn't quite figured out how to value yet. So the next time someone tells you to just get over it, just take a deep breath, give yourself grace, and remind yourself that your capacity to feel so deeply is exactly what makes you so incredibly human. You don't have to get over it. You just have to learn how to gently carry it forward. Have you ever been told to just dial it back? Like, maybe you're in the middle of talking about something you genuinely love and you see that familiar look in someone's eyes. You know the one, right? That slight, awkward pullback, the nervous little laugh, followed immediately by those dreaded words. Wow, you're really intense about this, aren't you? And just like that, the fire inside you kind of fizzles out. You retreat. It's direct, it's piercing, and honestly, it hurts a lot more than people realize. Being called too intense is rarely ever meant as a compliment in our society. It's usually a gentle, or sometimes not so gentle suggestion that you are taking up entirely too much emotional space in the room, that you care too much, that you feel things way too deeply. But what if I told you that this intensity isn't a flaw that needs fixing? What if it's actually a marker of a profound psychological depth, one that unfortunately comes with an agonizing, hidden loneliness? Today, we are going to unpack the psychology of the intense mind. We are going to look at exactly why your deep passions tend to alienate you from casual, everyday conversations, why the world feels like it's operating on a superficial level while you are constantly drowning in the deep end, and why this specific type of emotional intensity is such a heavy, isolating burden to carry. You see, society generally operates on an unspoken, universally accepted social contract of casualness. We are, for the most part, expected to just skim the surface of life. A simple, "How are you?" is generally supposed to be met with a polite, breezy, "I'm good, you," not a, 10-minute existential breakdown of your current life trajectory, or a passionate deep dive into your latest hyperfixation. But for the intense person, small talk isn't just boring. It actually feels like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. It feels deeply, fundamentally unnatural to your core. When you are wired for intensity, your brain is fundamentally seeking genuine connection, profound meaning, and absolute truth in every single interaction. So, when you try to bring that authentic, burning curiosity into a standard, everyday social setting, it causes immediate friction. People who are perfectly comfortable lounging in the shallow end of the pool get incredibly unnerved when you suddenly try to drag them into the Mariana Trench of conversation. And, I mean, you can't entirely blame them, can you? It's jarring for them, but for you, it's literally just Tuesday. You aren't trying to overwhelm anyone on purpose. You are simply sharing your baseline reality. You are offering them a piece of your soul, your genuine fascination with a specific topic, and they look at you like you just handed them a live grenade. Let's look at the actual psychology behind this phenomenon because, well, you aren't just making this up in your head. It's not just a quirky personality trait you chose to adopt one day. It's often deeply rooted in how your nervous system actually processes information. Psychologists talk a lot about a trait called sensory processing sensitivity. Now, this isn't about being overly emotional in a fragile, easily offended way. It literally means your central nervous system absorbs and processes stimuli, whether that's a complex piece of classical music, a layered philosophical idea, or the subtle emotional micro-expressions of the person sitting across from you, much more deeply than the average neurotypical brain. Your cognitive filters are essentially wired significantly wider. So when you get interested in a subject, you don't just read a quick Wikipedia article and happily move on to the next shiny thing. You consume it entirely. You obsess over it. You desperately want to understand its hidden mechanics, its expansive history, its broader implications for the world at large. This profound depth of processing is closely related to a brilliant concept formulated by the Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dąbrowski. He called it overexcitabilities, and honestly, once you understand this specific psychological framework, your entire life might finally start to make a whole lot more sense. Dombrowski observed that certain individuals have an innate, heightened, and amplified capacity to respond to various stimuli around them. He broke these overexcitabilities down into 5 distinct areas. If you are someone who is constantly being called intense, you are more than likely ringing the bell on quite a few of these, specifically the emotional, imaginational, and intellectual ones. Intellectual overexcitability means you possess this absolute, insatiable drive to ask questions. You love ideas, logical deduction, and deep, rigorous analysis. You are the person who, suddenly finds yourself wide awake at 3 a.m. reading about the physics of black holes or the history of ancient trade routes, purely because you felt an overwhelming need to know right then and there. Emotional overexcitability, on the other hand, means your feelings are just bigger. They take up so much more space inside of you. The highs are incredibly ecstatic, the lows are physically devastating, and your sense of empathy is so powerful that witnessing someone else's pain can actually physically hurt you. Imaginational overexcitability gives you a remarkably vivid, rich inner world, densely packed with metaphors and complex scenarios. So, when you combine these, when your intellect, your deep emotions, and your vivid imagination are all firing on all cylinders regarding a passion, the sheer energy you give off is immense. It's radiant. But to someone who doesn't experience the world this way, this radiance feels blinding. They instinctively pull back and tell you to dim your light. And this right here, this subtle but consistent pulling away from others, is exactly where the hidden loneliness truly takes root. It's a very specific, aching type of isolation that is incredibly hard to articulate to anyone else. It's not the obvious, visible loneliness of having absolutely no one around you. Oh no, you might actually have plenty of friends, friendly colleagues, and loving family members in your immediate circle. It's the distinct, painful loneliness of being surrounded by a room full of people and realizing, with a heavy sinking feeling in your chest, that absolutely nobody is actually speaking your native language. It's the quiet realization that if you were to fully open the floodgates of your mind, if you were to, I don't know, actually show them the raw, unedited, obsessive passion you have for your interests, they just wouldn't get it at all. They would likely think you are weird or unhinged, or that dreaded word making a return, intense. So, what do you naturally do in response to this continuous rejection? Well, you adapt to survive. You learn to read the room with the sense of hypervigilance. You start carefully and strategically curating exactly what you share with others. You drop small, safe breadcrumbs of your true self into conversations, waiting anxiously to see if anyone follows the trail, and when they inevitably don't, you quickly sweep the crumbs away and pretend they were never there. Maintaining this social mask is, frankly, absolutely exhausting. It takes a monumental amount of cognitive and emotional energy to constantly monitor and police yourself in everyday social situations. You are essentially running a highly demanding background program in your brain at all times, constantly asking yourself, am I talking way too fast right now? Did I get way too excited about that tiny, insignificant detail? Should I quickly change the subject to the weather or weekend plans so I don't totally freak them out? You end up actively diluting your own joy and suppressing your natural, beautiful enthusiasm just to make sure the people around you remain in their comfortable, shallow waters. You shrink yourself down to fit into neat, socially acceptable little boxes that were never, ever designed to hold your expansive nature in the first place. And while this coping strategy might successfully keep the social peace and prevent those awkward, judgmental stares, it creates a profound internal dissonance that quietly eats away at you day by day. By constantly protecting others from the full, unbridled force of your intensity, you are essentially starving your own soul of genuine connection. You are actively choosing superficial harmony over authentic, messy intimacy because, let's be entirely real here, how can you ever expect to feel truly loved, seen, or understood by anyone if the version of you that they interact with is a heavily watered-down replica? What the intense person truly craves, more than anything else in the entire world, is pure resonance. You aren't necessarily looking for an echo chamber or for someone to just blindly agree with you on every little thing. You are looking for someone who can effortlessly match your unique frequency. You want someone who, when you start vibrating with pure excitement over a brand new idea or a newly discovered passion, vibrates right back with equal, unapologetic force. You intensely crave someone who doesn't look at your enthusiasm like you are a complicated problem to be solved, but rather views you as a fascinating mystery to be explored together. You want to sit across a table from a friend, look them directly in the eye, and dive headfirst into a conversation so incredibly deep, complex, and winding that you completely lose all track of time, eventually emerging hours later feeling profoundly energized and alive, but actually finding those specific people. Honestly, it often feels like trying to find a single needle in a haystack in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. The harsh reality is that most day-to-day interactions leave you feeling like a jagged puzzle piece, desperately trying to jam itself into entirely the wrong spot, leaving you continuously wondering if there is something fundamentally wrong with you for caring this much about the world around you. So, where does this leave you when the exhaustion finally takes over? I mean, eventually, that heavily curated social mask we just talked about, it just breaks. It inevitably fractures because human beings are quite simply not designed to hold their breath forever. You can only play the part of the easygoing, chill friend for so long before your spirit starts to completely rebel against the constant charade. And when that mask finally slips, you might actually experience a really intense period of what psychologists often call burnout. It is not just your typical, everyday workplace burnout where you are merely tired from sending way too many emails. No, this is a profound, deep-seated emotional burnout. It is the absolute exhaustion of chronic, daily self-suppression. You might find yourself suddenly retreating entirely, isolating yourself not just from the shallow interactions, but, well, from the world at large. You think to yourself, if I cannot be my full, passionate, intense self out there, then I am just going to stay in here, where it is safe and quiet, and where nobody is judging me. And honestly, that is a perfectly understandable survival response. Your nervous system is just trying to protect you from the repeated micro-traumas of being fundamentally misunderstood by the people around you. But, while isolation definitely offers safety, it really doesn't offer healing. It doesn't actually solve that agonizing hidden loneliness. It just puts it on a shelf where you don't have to stare at it quite as closely every single day. To really navigate this properly, we have to talk about the broader cultural environment that makes you feel so alien in the first place. We live in a society that, quite frankly, absolutely idolizes the entire concept of being chill. Think about it for a second. Being detached, being aloof, acting like you don't really care all that much about anything. These are the specific traits that our modern culture tends to reward with social capital and popularity. Caring deeply, on the other hand, is increasingly viewed as a liability. It is seen as vulnerable, as messy, and, as uncool. When you are intense, you are the complete and total antithesis of chill. You are fire, and the world is currently completely obsessed with ice. So, when people look at you and call you too intense, they aren't necessarily offering an objective, truthful critique of your character. Often, they are actually just projecting their own deep internal discomfort with vulnerability onto you. Your absolute willingness to care out loud, to be intensely passionate and entirely unbothered by how uncool it might look, holds a giant mirror up to their own emotional numbness. And for a lot of folks, that reflection is really, truly terrifying. It forces them to subconsciously ask themselves, wow, when was the very last time I felt that deeply about literally anything? So, rather than boldly confront their own inner emptiness, it is significantly easier for them to just pathologize your fullness. It is just a psychological defense mechanism, designed to keep them perfectly comfortable in their own detachment. And this constant pathologizing isn't just something that happens in casual social settings. It actually heavily leaks into how we view mental health and clinical psychology too. So many people with deep passions and profound emotional depth find themselves sitting in therapy offices, desperately trying to figure out what exact, specific disorder they have that makes them this way. Now, to be incredibly clear, neurodivergence is very real, and traits of ADHD, autism, or high intelligence often perfectly overlap with this kind of intense, rapid cognitive processing. But the real danger here is the automatic societal assumption that just because you are intense, you are inherently broken and require immediate fixing. We are so incredibly quick to medicalize passion in this world. We try to medicate the overexcitabilities away, desperately trying to flatten the beautiful, dramatic peaks and valleys of a rich, vibrant inner life into a perfectly straight, dull, socially manageable line. But what if your intensity isn't a symptom of a disease at all? What if, honestly, it is actually your absolute greatest psychological asset? Kazimierz Dombrowski firmly believed that these exact intense experiences, the existential angst, the deep inner turmoil, the overwhelming passions, were not signs of mental illness in the slightest. He passionately argued they were the literal engine of advanced personality development. He believed that you simply cannot reach a higher level of moral and emotional evolution without experiencing this intense internal friction. Your intensity isn't a glitch in your system, it is the entire operating system of your profound emotional growth. So how do we actually begin to flip the script on this deeply ingrained narrative? How do you smoothly transition from feeling like a burdened, misunderstood outcast to actually thriving in your own intense skin? Well, the very first step, and honestly the absolute most difficult one for most people, is radical, unapologetic self-acceptance. You have to actively, consciously stop apologizing for taking up emotional space in the room. When you catch yourself about to say, "I'm sorry, I know I'm rambling," or "I know I'm getting way too intense about this," you need to just stop yourself right in your tracks. Take a deep breath. You do not owe the world a watered down, easily digestible, heavily filtered version of your soul. Your passion is a gift, a truly rare and beautiful compass that points directly toward real meaning and undeniable purpose. Think about everything that has ever actually pushed humanity forward, every great, moving work of art, every monumental scientific discovery, every single powerful social movement that changed history. Absolutely none of those incredible things were created by people who were just trying to be chill. They were forged in the absolute blazing fires of intense, obsessive, misunderstood people who simply refused to dial it back for the comfort of others. When you fully embrace your intensity, you are realizing that the sheer capacity to feel things so profoundly is an absolute superpower in a world practically begging you to just go numb. Of course, embracing this raw part of yourself doesn't magically make the loneliness entirely disappear overnight. You still, unfortunately, live in a world that largely operates on superficial small talk and casual pleasantries. But, what fundamentally changes is exactly how you choose to navigate that world. You stop trying to force deep, meaningful connections with people who are firmly, stubbornly committed to misunderstanding you. This naturally requires establishing some really firm, healthy personal boundaries. You learn to recognize very early on who is truly capable of swimming in the deep end with you and who absolutely needs to safely stay in the shallow water. And, crucially, you learn to be totally, completely okay with letting the shallow swimmers just be exactly who they are. You can have surface-level friends for surface-level things, and that is absolutely 100% fine. It really is. The primary key is just removing the heavy, unrealistic expectation that every single person in your entire life needs to fully comprehend the intricate, winding labyrinth of your brilliant mind. By consciously letting go of that totally impossible standard, you actually free up an incredible, massive amount of emotional energy. You stop wasting your precious, limited time trying to translate your soul into a language that other people completely refuse to learn, and you boldly start saving your deepest, most intense self for the people who have actually earned the absolute right to see it. And believe me when I say this, those people, the ones who actually speak your very specific, intense language, they are absolutely out there. They are probably sitting in their own rooms right now, feeling the exact same aching loneliness you are feeling, wondering if they are just entirely too much for this world too. Finding them definitely takes time, and it absolutely requires you to bravely keep your own personal beacon brightly lit. You have to stubbornly keep projecting your authentic, intense frequency out into the vast void, because that is quite literally the only way your people will ever be able to successfully find you. When you do finally cross paths with someone who effortlessly matches your energy, someone who doesn't nervously pull back when you decide to dive deep, the sheer, overwhelming relief is completely indescribable. It is like finally dropping a massive, suffocating weight you didn't even fully realize you were constantly carrying around with you. So please, whatever you do in this life, do not extinguish your fire just to make the room slightly more comfortable for people who are perfectly content sitting in the dark. I mean, it really is that simple. Your intensity, your wild obsessions, your absolute stubborn inability to just skim the surface of this incredibly complex life. These are the very best things about you. The world desperately needs more people who are brave enough to care entirely too much, because that is how things actually get better. So keep caring. Keep being beautifully, authentically, and undeniably intense. Have you ever walked into a room and just instantly felt the unspoken tension hanging in the air? Like nobody is yelling, nobody is actively arguing, but you can physically feel the heavy, residual heat of an anger that doesn't even belong to you. Well, if that specific feeling resonates with you, you are definitely not alone. I mean, it's a very real phenomenon. Actually, you might be dealing with what we in the psychology world sometimes refer to as the peacekeeper syndrome, especially as it relates to being a highly sensitive person, or what people often call an HSP. We live in a society that constantly tells us to, just let things go, or don't take things so personally, right? But for a highly sensitive peacekeeper, that is basically impossible. It's not just a matter of ignoring a feeling, it's about how your brain and nervous system literally process the emotional data in your environment. You don't just observe the anger of others, you absorb it, you metabolize it, and, essentially, you end up carrying it as if it were your own. So, what exactly is happening here? To really understand the peacekeeper syndrome, we kind of need to break down what it means to be highly sensitive. Being an HSP isn't a disorder or a flaw. It's actually a biologically based trait found in roughly 20% of the population. I mean, it's a profound survival mechanism, evolutionarily speaking. Your nervous system is just wired to process sensory and emotional information much more deeply than the average person. You notice the micro expressions, right? You hear the slight, almost imperceptible shift in someone's tone of voice. You pick up on the fact that your coworker closed a drawer just a tiny bit harder than usual, or that your partner's sigh wasn't just a regular sigh, but a sigh loaded with unspoken frustration. So, because your radar is constantly turned all the way up, you are always receiving this massive influx of emotional data. And while this makes you incredibly empathetic and, a deeply compassionate friend, it also makes you highly vulnerable to becoming a sort of emotional sponge. Now, think about what happens when you introduce anger into that highly sensitive ecosystem. Anger is, by its very nature, a loud and invasive emotion. Like, even if someone is trying to hide it, anger leaks out, it demands attention, and for the peacekeeper, anger feels like a glaring, blaring alarm bell going off in the middle of a perfectly quiet room. When a highly sensitive person encounters someone else's anger, their mirror neurons, which are the brain cells responsible for empathy and understanding the actions of others, kick into absolute overdrive. Basically, your brain starts simulating the other person's emotional state so intensely that the line between their anger and your own internal peace just completely blurs. You start to feel the tightness in your own chest. Your own heart rate might start to spike. It's like you are literally experiencing the physiological symptoms of a rage that you didn't even originate. But here is where the syndrome part really comes into play, and where it gets, well, pretty complicated. The peacekeeper doesn't just feel the anger and walk away. I mean, if you could just walk away, it wouldn't really be a problem, right? Instead, the peacekeeper feels an overwhelming, almost compulsive need to fix it, to neutralize the threat. You see, for the highly sensitive peacekeeper, someone else's negative emotion is interpreted by the brain as an immediate, visceral danger to their own safety and equilibrium. So, your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, starts screaming that the environment is fundamentally unsafe. And the only way to feel safe again is to make the other person stop being angry. You go into overdrive trying to manage their emotions. You apologize for things you absolutely didn't do. You twist yourself into knots trying to anticipate their every need. You walk on eggshells, desperately trying to smooth things over, just to bring the temperature of the room back down to a manageable level. This behavior usually has deep roots. Like, it almost always traces back to childhood. For many peacekeepers, absorbing and managing other people's anger was actually a learned survival tactic. Maybe you grew up in a household where the emotional climate was incredibly unpredictable. Maybe you had a parent who was volatile, or struggling with depression, or just chronically stressed out. As a highly sensitive child, you realized very quickly that the only way to keep yourself safe, or to keep the fragile family unit stable, was to become the emotional thermostat of the entire house. I mean, you learned to read the room before you even knew how to read a book. You learned that if you could anticipate a parent's bad mood and proactively soothe them, you could prevent a chaotic outburst. You essentially became a human lightning rod, willingly taking on the strike of their negative emotions so that the rest of the house wouldn't catch fire. And the tragic irony here is that as a child, this actually worked. Well, kind of. It kept the peace in the short term, but the problem is, you inadvertently carried that exact same coping mechanism into your adulthood, where it no longer serves you at all. In psychology, this dynamic is very closely related to the fawning trauma response. You've probably heard of fight, flight, or freeze, right? Well, fawn is the fourth response. Fawning is essentially people-pleasing as a profound trauma response. It's appeasing an angry or potentially threatening person in order to avoid conflict and ensure your own safety. When you are caught in the grips of the peacekeeper syndrome, you are chronically fawning. You are so utterly terrified of the discomfort and the potential rejection that comes with conflict that you will literally sacrifice your own emotional well-being to keep the peace. You absorb their anger, process it through your own overloaded nervous system, and hand them back a calm, sanitized version of the interaction. But let's be really honest about what this actually does to you on a daily basis. Carrying everyone else's emotional baggage is an incredibly heavy load. I mean, it is absolutely exhausting. When you constantly act as the emotional buffer for the people around you, you are basically living in a chronic state of hyperarousal. Your cortisol levels stay elevated. You might struggle with chronic fatigue, tension headaches, or unexplained anxiety. You know, it's because your body is working overtime to process not just your own life, but the complex lives and volatile emotions of everyone you care about. You become so laser-focused on reading the emotional weather of other people that you completely lose touch with your own internal climate. If someone asks you, "Hey, what do you actually want?" or "Why are you upset?" you might just draw a total blank. Like you don't even know the answer anymore because your entire identity has been built around reacting to and meticulously managing the feelings of others. Furthermore, this constant, relentless peacemaking actually prevents real, authentic connection from forming. I mean, think about it for a second. If you are always smoothing things over and absorbing the anger without ever letting the natural conflict play out, you are essentially denying the other person the opportunity to take responsibility for their own feelings. You are insulating them from the natural consequences of their own dark moods. And in doing so, you are kind of enabling them, right? You create a dynamic where they subconsciously learn that they can just vent their toxic, unfiltered energy right into the room, and you will dutifully act as the emotional Roomba, just quietly vacuuming it all up. It creates a deeply imbalanced, unfair relationship where you are doing all of the heavy emotional labor and they are just getting a free ride. And this inevitably leads to a very quiet, very insidious form of resentment that builds up inside the peacekeeper over time. Because, well, the truth is, you are angry too. You are incredibly angry, but because you are a dedicated peacekeeper, you believe that your anger is dangerous. You've successfully convinced yourself that expressing your own frustration will entirely shatter the fragile peace you work so desperately hard to maintain. So you swallow it. You bury it down deep into your stomach. You rationalize it away by telling yourself things like, "Oh, they're just having a really hard day," or "I'm just being way too sensitive again." But that swallowed anger doesn't just magically disappear. It ferments. It turns into a dark resentment, which then rapidly turns into a heavy guilt because, you know, highly sensitive people feel incredibly guilty for feeling resentful toward the people they love. It is a vicious, completely exhausting cycle that keeps you trapped in a cage of your own making, totally cut off from your own authentic self and your own valid boundaries. So you really have to sit down and ask yourself, what is the actual cost of this artificial peace? Because that's what it is, right? It's completely artificial. True peace isn't just the mere absence of yelling, it's the presence of authenticity, mutual respect, and genuine emotional safety. When you absorb everyone else's anger to just keep things quiet, you aren't creating real peace. You are just stockpiling the tension inside your own body. You are actively trading your internal sanity for temporary, external quiet. And, I mean, eventually, the dam is going to break. The physical body can only hold so much unprocessed emotional energy before it starts to physically and mentally break down. You might find yourself suddenly snapping over something tiny, or you might just collapse into total burnout, unable to get out of bed, because the sheer weight of the world's emotional gravity has finally crushed you. It's a profound, paradigm-shifting realization when you finally understand that your empathy, which is genuinely a beautiful gift, has been completely hijacked by a deeply ingrained, outdated survival mechanism. Recognizing this hidden dynamic is the absolute foundation of everything. It's the very moment the lights finally turn on in a dark, confusing room. You start to actually see the invisible strings tying your nervous system to the shifting moods of your partner, your boss, your friends, and your family members. You start to realize that you have been living almost your entire life as a reflective mirror rather than as a solid person with your own clearly defined edges. And while acknowledging this reality can feel incredibly daunting, like you are suddenly standing completely exposed on the edge of a massive cliff, it is also undeniably the very first step toward true, lasting emotional liberation. Because once you can actually see the cage of the peacekeeper syndrome, you can finally start figuring out how to pick the lock. You can begin the incredibly hard but completely necessary work of untangling your energy from theirs. You can finally start to ask the really scary, important questions like, who am I when I'm not frantically fixing someone else's bad mood? And that, honestly, is where the real beautiful journey begins. So, how do we actually practically break out of this exhausting cycle? I mean, it is one thing to intellectually understand the mechanics of the peacekeeper syndrome, right? It is an entirely different beast to actually stop doing it in the heat of the moment when your anxiety is flaring. You see, the goal here isn't to stop being a highly sensitive person. You can't just, surgically remove your empathy, and honestly, you really shouldn't want to. Your sensitivity is a profound, beautiful asset. The actual goal is to build an invisible, yet practically impenetrable, emotional boundary. Think of it like installing a high-quality screen door on your house. You still want to let the fresh air and the sunlight in, right? But you desperately need to keep the bugs, the dirt, and the debris out. Right now, as a chronic peacekeeper, you are essentially living in a house with no doors and no windows, completely exposed to whatever random emotional hurricane happens to be blowing through your immediate neighborhood. We need to start building those solid walls, slowly and intentionally, so you can finally decide what gets to come inside. The very first step, and honestly, this is usually the hardest one for people to grasp, is practicing immediate physical separation, like literally putting physical space between your nervous system and their anger. When you feel that familiar spike of adrenaline, when you notice that someone else's bad mood is starting to heavily infiltrate your own body, you have to give yourself permission to just leave the room. You don't have to make a big, dramatic exit or announce that you are setting a boundary. You can just quietly say, hey, I need to go grab a glass of water, or I am just going to step outside for some fresh air. I mean, it sounds almost ridiculously simple, but taking yourself out of the immediate energetic field of an angry person abruptly breaks that magnetic pull. It interrupts the fawning response before it can fully hijack your brain. You are basically hitting the pause button, giving your amygdala a crucial, desperately needed moment to realize that you are not actually under physical attack and that you have valid choices. Once you have created that bit of physical distance, you have to start doing some serious, intentional cognitive reframing. This is where you actively challenge the deeply subconscious narrative that their anger is somehow your personal responsibility. I want you to imagine literally repeating a quiet mantra in your head. This is not mine. Like, say it over and over again until you actually believe it. This is not mine. When someone is stomping around the kitchen, aggressively slamming cabinet doors, your immediate instinct is to rush in and fix it so the noise stops. But you have to consciously stop yourself and tell your brain their emotional regulation is their job, not mine. I mean, visualizing this dynamic can be incredibly helpful. Picture their anger as a heavy, dark, awkwardly shaped package that they are frantically trying to hand over to you. You do not have to sign for that package. You can just let it sit right there on the floor between you. You can look at it, acknowledge that it absolutely exists, but you strictly do not have to pick it up and carry it around for them. Now, let's be totally real for a second about what happens next. Doing this is going to feel absolutely excruciating at first, like I cannot possibly overstate how incredibly uncomfortable it is going to be for your body when you stop stepping in to magically fix everything. You are going to be left sitting with an enormous amount of internal buzzing anxiety. Your brain is going to loudly scream at you, basically telling you that you are a terrible, deeply selfish person for letting someone you love struggle with their big feelings. You will feel an overwhelming, almost physical itch to just apologize, to smooth it over, to do whatever it takes to make the heavy energy dissipate. But you have to learn how to sit inside that thick discomfort. You have to endure the quiet, awkward tension of an unresolved conflict. I mean, this is the true, absolute core of healing the peacekeeper syndrome. You are deliberately retraining your nervous system to tolerate the fact that someone else can be unhappy and you can still be perfectly, completely safe. To survive that intense discomfort without caving in, you really need to lean heavily on nervous system regulation techniques. Like, you can't just white-knuckle your way through it. Your willpower will eventually snap. You need practical, bodily tools to soothe your own physical self while the other person is having their meltdown. Deep, slow, intentional breathing is incredibly important here. You know, focusing on extending your exhales naturally signals to your vagus nerve that the environment is actually secure. Grounding exercises are also absolutely essential for highly sensitive people in these moments. Feeling your feet planted firmly on the floor, noticing the texture of your clothing, essentially pulling your consciousness out of their emotional whirlwind and anchoring it firmly back into your own physical body. You are fundamentally shifting your entire focus from what do they urgently need right now to be okay to what do I need right now to stay completely centered. It is a massive structural shift in your entire orientation to the world. As you continually practice this, you are going to have to profoundly redefine what empathy actually means to you. For a very long time, you have basically confused empathy with emotional absorption. You thought that being a good, empathetic friend, partner, or child meant bleeding when they get cut. But true, healthy empathy is not about merging your identities until you can't tell whose feelings are whose. Real empathy is standing firmly on your own 2 feet, looking across the emotional gap and calmly saying, I see that you are struggling and I care about you deeply, but I am not going to drown with you. It is holding a compassionate space for someone without taking on their pain as your own personal burden. I mean, think about a trained lifeguard for a second. A lifeguard cannot actually save a panicking, drowning person if they allow themselves to be pulled under the water too, right? They have to stay incredibly buoyant. They have to fiercely maintain their own strength and stability in order to actually be of any real help. Of course, you need to mentally prepare yourself for the inevitable and sometimes intense pushback. Like, when you abruptly change the unwritten rules of the game, the people who were heavily benefiting from the old rules are probably going to get pretty upset. When you suddenly stop acting as the dedicated emotional sponge, the people around you are going to be forced to finally sit with their own messy, unmanaged anger. And let me tell you, they are not going to like it one bit. They might suddenly accuse you of being cold or distant or totally uncaring. They might even temporarily escalate their anger, subconsciously trying to force you back into your old, familiar, accommodating role of the fawning peacekeeper. You know, this is often called an extinction burst in the psychology world. It's when a toxic dynamic temporarily gets worse before it gets better because the person is desperately, frantically trying to get the old, predictable result from you. You have to firmly hold the line during this messy phase. I mean, you absolutely cannot cave in because their extreme reaction is just glaring proof that your new boundary was desperately needed in the first place. And while you are holding those difficult boundaries with others, you also have to quietly do the really vital internal work of reconnecting with your own repressed, deeply buried anger. Because remember, we talked about how peacekeepers shove all of their own legitimate frustration down deep inside. Well, it is finally time to cautiously let that out, but in a healthy, controlled, and safe way. You see, anger is not inherently bad or destructive. Anger is actually a beautiful, deeply protective emotion. It is your soul's urgent way of telling you that a boundary has been crossed, that a situation is profoundly unfair, or that your needs are being completely ignored. As a recovering peacekeeper, you need to start warmly welcoming your own anger back into your daily life. You might need to literally practice expressing it in private. Journaling angrily without editing yourself, punching a heavy pillow, or just talking openly with a therapist about all the bitter resentments you have been silently swallowing for decades. You have to realize that you are allowed to be mad. Your feelings matter just as much as everyone else's in the room. As you slowly, carefully stop absorbing everyone else's dark moods and start powerfully owning your own complex emotions, something truly magical begins to happen in your relationships. You start to experience what real, unvarnished intimacy actually feels like. Because, like I said before, artificial, forced peace is a massive barrier to genuine connection. When you finally stop meticulously managing everyone's mood to prevent an explosion, you give them the dignity of owning their own emotional process, and you give yourself the immense freedom to just exist without constantly working a second, totally unpaid emotional job. The relationships that are actually healthy, sturdy, and worth keeping will eventually adjust to this new, healthier dynamic. They will grow much stronger, deeper, and vastly more respectful. And honestly, the relationships that completely shatter just because you stopped constantly abandoning yourself to keep the peace, well, those were never really true relationships to begin with. They were basically just emotional hostage situations conveniently disguised as love and friendship. Breaking free from the heavy chains of the peacekeeper syndrome is definitely not a quick overnight fix. I mean, it is a daily, sometimes hourly, rigorous practice of choosing your own sanity over the agonizing, familiar urge to anxiously manage the room. You will absolutely mess up along the way. You will fall back into fawning from time to time, and you will accidentally absorb a toxic mood here and there. Right? That is just part of being a flawed human and painstakingly unlearning decades of deeply ingrained survival mechanisms. But every single time you notice it happening, every time you deliberately take a step back, take a deep breath, and quietly say, "This is not mine," you are fundamentally rewiring your sensitive nervous system. You are permanently reclaiming your incredibly beautiful, highly sensitive nature from the exhausting grip of fear and chronic anxiety. You are slowly, surely transforming from a fragile, overwhelmed emotional sponge into a deeply grounded, powerfully empathetic force. And that, ultimately, is the absolute greatest gift you could ever give to yourself and to the world around you. You finally get to be at peace. Truly, deeply at peace, entirely on your own authentic terms. You are sitting on your couch, doing absolutely nothing, and instead of feeling peaceful, you feel completely, profoundly guilty. Like you are supposed to be relaxing, right? You literally carved out this time, maybe you even scheduled it in your calendar. But your brain is treating this downtime like a moral failure. If this sounds familiar, well, you are not alone. It is a highly specific kind of exhaustion. We are talking about why deep thinkers, people who are constantly analyzing, processing, and breaking down the world around them, basically cannot truly relax. It is this hidden guilt of unproductive rest, and I mean it is completely draining. You are physically still, but mentally you are running a marathon that never actually ends. So let's just get right into it and kind of unpack what it actually means to be a deep thinker in this context. I am not talking about like sitting under a tree pondering the works of Aristotle or pretending to be some kind of misunderstood genius. When psychologists talk about deep thinkers, they are often referring to people with high cognitive complexity or a high need for cognition. Basically, it means your brain's default state is to process information deeply. You don't just watch a movie. You analyze the underlying themes, the character motivations, the societal implications of the plot. You don't just have a conversation, you sort of replay it later, analyzing the micro expressions, wondering if that one thing you said came off slightly weird. I mean, it is exhausting, right? Your mind is essentially a web browser with about 73 tabs open at all times, and, well, music is playing from one of them, and you have absolutely no idea which one it is. And this brings us to the core issue with relaxation. For a deep thinker, relaxation is, kind of paradoxically, a trigger for anxiety. When you stop physically moving, when you stop actively engaging in a structured task, your brain doesn't just power down. In fact, it often does the exact opposite. Without the distraction of work or chores or social interaction, your internal monologue suddenly gets a megaphone. It is like, well, imagine you are driving a car at 80 miles an hour and then you just slam on the brakes. The car stops, but everything inside the car flies forward. That is what happens to your thoughts when you try to just sit still. You are hit with this massive wave of unprocessed data, worries about the future, regrets about the past, existential questions about your purpose in life. So, sitting on the couch doing nothing doesn't actually feel restful at all. It feels like you are trapped in a room with your most intense, demanding self. And then, of course, there is the guilt. This is where it gets really insidious. I mean, truly deeply psychological. We live in a society that essentially equates productivity with human worth. We are sort of conditioned from a very, very young age to believe that if we are not producing something, achieving something, or at least learning something, then we are completely wasting our time. For the average person, this hustle culture is annoying, but for the deep thinker, well, it actually becomes internalized as a very harsh, unforgiving inner critic. Because your brain is so capable of holding complex ideas and solving problems, you kind of feel this constant, underlying obligation to be using it. It is this feeling of, I have the capacity to figure this out, to plan for next year, to optimize my life, so why on earth am I just sitting here? You know what I mean? The guilt of unproductive rest stems from this false belief that your resting state is a wasted state. Let's look at the science of this for a second, because it is actually fascinating. In neuroscience, there is something called the default mode network, or the DMN. This is the network of interacting brain regions that is active when you are not focused on the outside world. So, when you are daydreaming, recalling memories, or just letting your mind wander, your DMN is lighting up. Now, for some people, the DMN is a place of pleasant daydreaming, but for deep thinkers, people who are highly prone to anxiety or overanalysis, the DMN is essentially a rumination machine. When you try to relax, your DMN activates, and suddenly you are hyperfixated on a perceived flaw in your career trajectory, or you are like spiraling about climate change or the economy. So, relaxation biologically forces you into the very brain state that causes you the most distress. Is it any wonder that you unconsciously try to avoid it? Because you cannot stand the noise of your own DMN, you probably engage in what I like to call decoy rest. Decoy rest is when you try to trick yourself into relaxing by doing things that still feel slightly productive. I mean, really think about it. When was the last time you literally just sat on the porch and watched the clouds? Probably never. Instead, when a deep thinker tries to relax, they will, put on a 3-hour historical documentary. Or they will listen to a very dense educational podcast while they fold the laundry. Or they will read a heavy non-fiction book about behavioral economics. It is like you are saying to yourself, okay, I am resting my body, but don't worry, I am still feeding my brain. I am still, being useful. But this is a trap. It is a massive psychological trap. You are just substituting physical labor with cognitive labor, and you are never actually allowing your nervous system to fully downregulate and just breathe. This inability to downregulate leads to a very specific kind of burnout. It is not necessarily the burnout of working 80 hours a week, though that can certainly be part of it. It is cognitive burnout. It is the exhaustion of carrying the mental weight of the world. The weight of constant processing every single day from the moment you wake up. And the profound tragedy here is that deep thinkers actually need true, unproductive rest more than anyone else. Because your brain is constantly running at full capacity, it burns through cognitive resources like crazy. I mean, you are essentially driving a sports car in first gear all the time. The engine is just screaming. But because of the guilt, because of that nagging voice telling you that you should be doing more, you deny yourself the very thing you need to prevent the engine from literally blowing up. And we have to talk about how this impacts your sense of self. When you cannot relax without feeling guilty, you start to view yourself as a machine. You start to evaluate your days purely based on output. If you had a Sunday where you just laid around, played a video game, and took a nap, your brain immediately categorizes that as a bad day, a completely failed day. You end up going to sleep on Sunday night feeling so stressed out about the fact that you didn't relax correctly, or that you wasted your weekend, which then totally ruins your Monday morning before it even begins. It is this vicious, never-ending cycle, right? You are stressed because you work so hard, so you try to rest, but resting makes you feel guilty and anxious, which causes more stress, which makes you feel like you need more rest, but you still don't know how to actually do it. It is basically a psychological catch-22 that leaves you totally exhausted. A huge part of this stems from a fear of losing control. For a highly analytical mind, planning, thinking, and worrying are all sort of defense mechanisms. It is like your brain believes that if it just thinks hard enough about a problem, it can somehow magically prevent anything bad from happening. Worrying feels like a productive action. It actually feels like preparation. So when you try to let go of that, when you try to just exist in the present moment without constantly analyzing it, it feels profoundly unsafe. It is like, dropping your shield in the middle of a battlefield. Your brain is screaming, "What are you doing? We have to be on guard. We have to figure out how to pay off the mortgage 5 years early while simultaneously solving our deeply rooted childhood trauma." Giving up that mental control, even for just an hour of sitting outside, triggers a deeply rooted vulnerability. You might also find that this guilt makes you highly irritable when other people try to force you to relax. Like, if a partner or a well-meaning friend says, "Hey, just chill out, stop overthinking it," it doesn't help at all, does it? In fact, it kind of feels insulting. It feels incredibly isolating because to them, relaxation is just a simple matter of sitting down and turning off the TV. They honestly do not understand that for you, turning off the external noise just turns up the internal volume to an unbearable level. They don't see the massive amount of cognitive effort it takes for you to genuinely let your guard down. So you end up feeling wildly misunderstood, and maybe you even start performing relaxation for their benefit. You just sit there, pretending to peacefully watch a sitcom, while inside you are silently cataloging all the things you are failing to accomplish right now. Ultimately, what we are looking at in this first half of the equation is a fundamental disconnect between what your body needs and what your mind will actually allow. The deep thinker is locked in a constant battle with their own intellect. You are so incredibly good at thinking your way out of problems that you try to think your way into relaxation, which is, well, it is literally impossible. True rest is the absence of that analytical thinking, and the guilt you feel is just a symptom of a mind that is absolutely terrified of being quiet. It is a profound realization when you finally understand that your inability to rest isn't because you aren't tired enough, but because you are way too attached to your own productivity as a source of identity. We have built an entire mental architecture around the idea that doing nothing is a sin, and until we actually begin to dismantle that deeply flawed belief, the couch will always feel like a place of punishment rather than a place of peace. So where does all of this leave us? I mean, knowing why your brain is actively sabotaging your downtime is, it is definitely a good first step, but it doesn't magically make the couch any less intimidating. If you are sitting there realizing that your entire relationship with rest is basically built on a foundation of guilt and anxiety, well, you have to actually start rewiring how you approach the whole concept of doing nothing. And I am not going to sit here and tell you to just take a bubble bath or try meditating, because honestly, if you are a deep thinker, telling you to just sit quietly with your thoughts is basically a recipe for an existential crisis. We have to be a lot more strategic than that. We have to sort of trick your brain into feeling safe enough to actually power down. The very first, and honestly the most crucial, psychological shift that needs to happen is completely redefining what productivity actually means in your life. Right now, you probably view rest as the opposite of productivity. You think of them as these two completely opposing forces, but from a purely neurological standpoint, that is just completely false. Rest is not the absence of productivity. It is actually the biological prerequisite for it. I mean, think about professional athletes. They don't view their recovery days as like wasting time. They view sleep and muscle recovery as vital components of their training. Your brain is a physical organ, and cognitive rest is the maintenance required to keep that highly analytical machine functioning. When you start framing your downtime not as an indulgence, but as, necessary maintenance, the guilt sort of begins to lose its power over you. But of course, you can't just flip a switch in your brain from high-level analytical thinking to total Zen relaxation. That is a completely unrealistic expectation. What deep thinkers really need is something called a transition zone. You see, when you jump straight from a super intense, demanding workday right onto the sofa, the momentum of your thoughts just carries over. You need a buffer. A transition zone is a dedicated, period of time where you actively step down your cognitive load. It could be something as simple as changing out of your work clothes the absolute second you get home, or taking a 20-minute walk where you literally refuse to listen to a podcast, or even just doing the dishes while listening to some, really lo-fi music. You are basically giving your nervous system a gentle ramp down rather than forcing it to abruptly crash into a brick wall of silence. And this leads us perfectly into the concept of active versus passive rest, which is honestly an absolute game changer for people who chronically overthink. Passive rest is what we typically think of when we imagine relaxing, lying down, scrolling through your phone, watching TV. But as we discussed earlier, passive rest leaves your default mode network wide open to just ruminate and spiral. Active rest, on the other hand, is about engaging your brain in something that requires focus, but requires absolutely zero deep analytical problem solving. You want to occupy the brain's processing centers just enough to keep out the intrusive, guilty thoughts, but not so much that you are actually draining your cognitive battery. It is about finding the sweet spot of mental engagement. So, what does active rest actually look like? Well, it usually involves entering what psychologists call a flow state through low-stakes, tactile hobbies. Things that use your hands are incredibly effective for this. I am talking about things like, knitting, doing a mildly challenging jigsaw puzzle, painting by numbers, weeding the garden, or even building a Lego set. When you are doing these things, your brain is engaged in a highly structured, predictable task. You know exactly what the next step is. There are no abstract problems to solve, and there is no massive societal implication to worry about. You are just putting one piece of a puzzle next to another. It literally forces your brain to stay present in the physical moment, which basically shuts off that megaphone of anxiety we talked about earlier. It is like a backdoor way to quiet your mind without actually having to sit in complete silence. Another incredibly powerful psychological tool you can use is called worry scheduling. This comes straight out of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it works wonders for highly analytical people. Because your brain genuinely believes that worrying is a productive form of problem solving, trying to suppress those thoughts when you are relaxing just makes them push back even harder. So, instead of fighting it, you actually give those thoughts a designated time and place. You might say to yourself, okay, from 5 p.m. to 5:20 p.m., I am going to sit at my desk, take out a notebook, and I am going to intensely worry and overanalyze everything. You write it all down, you literally purge it onto the paper, and then, when that 20 minutes is up, you close the notebook. Later, when you are trying to relax and the guilt or the anxiety pops up, you can sort of tell your brain, hey, we already did the worrying for today, and we have another session scheduled for tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Right now, we are off the clock. We also have to address the purely physiological side of this, because anxiety and guilt aren't just thoughts in your head, they are deeply physical sensations trapped in your body. When you try to relax, your body might literally feel agitated. Your chest might feel tight, your breathing gets a bit shallow, you might feel this weird buzzing energy in your arms and legs. That is your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, staying activated because it thinks dropping your guard is dangerous. You have to actively signal to your body that you are safe. This is where somatic practices come in. Something as simple as physiological sighs, taking 2 quick inhales through the nose, followed by a long, slow exhale through the mouth, can literally reset your autonomic nervous system. You are speaking directly to your vagus nerve, bypassing your overactive brain entirely and telling your body, hey, look, there is no tiger chasing us. We can stand down now. Now, I want to warn you about a massive trap that deep thinkers fall into once they start learning about these rest techniques. It is the trap of trying to, optimize your relaxation. You will be tempted to turn resting into a brand new project. You will buy the perfect puzzle, you will set up a meticulously curated meditation corner, you will track your heart rate variability on a smartwatch to ensure you are relaxing efficiently. Stop. Just stop. If you do that, you are just recreating the exact same high-pressure dynamic of productivity, just with a different coat of paint. You have to let go of the idea of doing relaxation correctly. If you spend an hour staring blankly at the wall and your mind wanders a bit, that isn't a failure. I mean, the goal here isn't perfection. The goal is simply giving yourself permission to exist without constantly having to earn your space on this earth through output. And that brings us to the hardest part of all. Dealing directly with that loud, critical voice inside your head. When the guilt of unproductive rest washes over you, when that voice says, "You are being lazy, you should be doing something useful right now," you have to practice actively answering it back. You can't just ignore it because it will just keep yelling. You have to talk to yourself with the kind of radical self-compassion that you would probably offer to a good friend. You have to literally say to yourself, "I hear that I am feeling guilty right now, and that is okay. But I have worked hard, my mind is tired, and I am choosing to rest because I am a human being, not a machine." It feels incredibly cheesy at first, I know. It feels sort of fake. But you are essentially reparenting your own brain, slowly dismantling decades of conditioning that told you your worth was tied exclusively to your productivity. Ultimately, learning to truly relax as a deep thinker is an ongoing practice. It is not something you are going to master overnight. There will still be weekends where you feel that itch, that profound, nagging urge to just go organize a closet or reorganize your entire financial portfolio just to soothe your anxiety. And sometimes you might give in to it. That is fine. But the key is awareness. The key is recognizing that the guilt you feel isn't a factual indicator that you are doing something wrong. It is just a conditioned response from a very tired, very loud brain. You have to gently, patiently teach yourself that the world is not going to fall apart just because you decided to take an afternoon off from holding it all together. You possess this incredibly beautiful, complex, capable mind. It allows you to see the world in rich detail, to solve difficult problems, to deeply empathize with others, and to understand the underlying mechanics of life. But that gift comes with a profound responsibility to take care of the vessel that holds it. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you certainly cannot analyze the depths of the universe if your own mind is desperately gasping for a moment of peace. You have to start believing on a core level that doing nothing is actually doing something incredibly vital. It is healing, it is restoring, it is, quite frankly, an act of rebellion against a world that demands you be useful every single second of the day. So, tonight, or this weekend, I challenge you to try something genuinely radical. I want you to sit down, whether it is with a dumb puzzle, or a sketchbook, or literally just a cup of tea, and I want you to actively practice doing nothing of societal value. When the guilt creeps in, and it will, I promise you it will, I want you to just notice it. Don't fight it, don't run from it, just sort of look at it and say, "Yep, there is that guilt again," and then, gently, firmly, bring your attention back to your perfectly useless, wonderfully restful activity. Give yourself the profound gift of unproductivity, because you, just by virtue of being here, are already enough. You don't have to constantly prove it. You have earned your rest. Now, you just have to be brave enough to actually take it. Just to add a final thought here, because I think it is so important to really drive this home, the journey to peaceful rest is really a journey back to yourself. It is about stripping away all the expectations, all the external validation, and realizing that your inner world doesn't always have to be a bustling factory of ideas. It can just be a quiet room. It can be a sanctuary. When you finally allow the dust to settle, when you stop forcing the gears to turn, you might be surprised to find that the clarity you were desperately searching for through constant overthinking was actually just waiting for you in the stillness. So, take a breath. Drop your shoulders. The work will still be there tomorrow, but this moment, this opportunity to just be, is yours right now. Do not let the guilt steal it from you. Take your rest. You absolutely need it. You can untangle a massive, multi-layered crisis at work that has everyone else completely panicked, but you will stand in the grocery store aisle for 20 minutes, completely paralyzed by the choice between two brands of pasta sauce. You can design a 10-year strategic roadmap for a business or learn a complicated new software in an afternoon, but when someone asks you what you want for dinner, your brain just shuts down. Well, on the surface, it makes absolutely zero sense. I mean, how can a mind that is so obviously capable of high-level, complex processing completely short-circuit when it comes to the simplest, most basic daily tasks? Look, honestly, if you have ever felt this way, you have probably spent a lot of time silently judging yourself for it. You might even think you are just fundamentally broken or lazy, or that you somehow lack basic life skills. But actually, it is not a flaw in your character at all. What you are experiencing is a very specific, deeply fascinating psychological phenomenon. It is essentially the paradox of the gifted mind. And today, we are going to break down exactly why your brain operates this way. And trust me, it is going to make so much sense. So, let us start by looking at how your brain actually perceives a problem because, not all problems are created equal. When you are faced with a complex issue like, let us say, a massive project at work, a crisis in a relationship, or a deep philosophical question, your brain immediately recognizes that there are stakes involved. I mean, there is a puzzle to be solved here. Complex problems usually come with parameters, rules, and a ton of interconnected variables. For a highly analytical or gifted mind, this is exactly like throwing a massive piece of raw meat to a hungry lion. Your brain, which is probably wired to seek out patterns and connections, finally gets to do what it was built to do. It fires up your executive functioning skills, it pulls information from your working memory, and it starts calculating outcomes. Honestly, you probably enter a state of flow. It feels natural, almost effortless, because complex problems require deep focus, and your brain actually thrives on that level of deep, engaging stimulation. But then, we have the simple stuff. Answering an email, picking a movie on Netflix, deciding whether to do the laundry now or later. Let us be real, these choices do not have clear parameters. There is no grand puzzle to solve. There is no major intellectual victory waiting for you at the end of folding your socks. And because of that, your brain just does not know what to do with the information. Like, it literally lacks the proper stimulation to fully engage. So instead of dealing with the simple choice at face value, a highly active mind will often overcomplicate it. I mean, if you are picking a restaurant, you are not just thinking about what you want to eat. You are subconsciously analyzing the travel time, the parking situation, the cost, the nutritional value, the atmosphere, and trying to predict the future satisfaction levels of everyone involved. You are essentially using a supercomputer to do basic arithmetic, and as a result, the system just completely crashes. You freeze, you get analysis paralysis over a sandwich. And, this brings us to a massive psychological concept that explains so much of this everyday exhaustion, which is decision fatigue. Honestly, every single day, you wake up with a finite amount of cognitive energy. You can think of it like a battery, right? Every choice you make, no matter how big or small, drains a little bit of that battery. Now, if you are the type of person who is constantly solving complex problems, innovating, or navigating high-stress situations, you are burning through massive amounts of that cognitive energy on a macro level. Your brain is doing heavy lifting all day long, so by the time you are faced with a micro decision like what to wear or what to cook, your battery is completely in the red. The cognitive well is just dry. The brain literally looks at the choice and says, "No, I am done. I cannot process one more variable today." This is actually why you see so many wildly successful people, like tech founders or brilliant artists, wearing the exact same outfit every single day. They are intentionally eliminating micro decisions because they know their brain simply does not have the bandwidth for them after dealing with the big stuff. But it is not just about being tired, you know? It is also deeply connected to a psychological framework known as maximizing versus satisficing. Basically, psychologists have found that people generally fall into one of two categories when making decisions. Satisficers are people who have a set of criteria, and as soon as they find an option that meets that criteria, they choose it and they move on. They are satisfied with good enough. But maximizers, and honestly, highly intelligent or gifted people, are almost always maximizers, are completely different. Maximizers need to know that they are making the absolute best possible choice. Like, not just a good choice, but the optimal one. And when you apply that mindset to complex problems, it is a superpower. It is what allows you to create brilliant strategies and catch errors that other people miss. But when you apply that exact same maximizing mindset to buying a vacuum cleaner or picking a font for a document, it is an absolute nightmare. You see, when a maximizer tries to make a simple daily choice, their brain automatically treats it with the exact same gravity and weight as a life-altering decision. You start trying to optimize the mundane. You think, well, if I buy this brand of coffee, I might be missing out on a slightly better flavor profile from that other brand. Or maybe I should check the ethical sourcing of the beans. Or maybe I should just stop drinking coffee altogether. Because I read a study about cortisol last week. You know, before you know it, a 30-second task has morphed into a deeply exhausting existential debate. The gifted mind struggles with simple choices because it fundamentally refuses to believe that a choice can just be simple. It is always looking for the hidden variable, the catch, or the unseen consequence. And frankly, applying that level of rigorous intellectual scrutiny to every tiny detail of your daily life is a fast track to severe burnout. There is also a fascinating neurological component to this, involving what neuroscientists call the default mode network, or the DMN. The DMN is the part of your brain that lights up when you are not actively focusing on a specific task. It is responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and thinking about the past or the future. For people with highly active, restless minds, their default mode network is incredibly robust. It is always running in the background, making connections and generating ideas. So, when you try to force your brain to focus on a low-stimulation, mundane task, like washing the dishes or paying a utility bill, your DMN essentially rebels. It is like, wait, why are we doing this boring thing when we could be contemplating the fundamental nature of the universe or replaying that awkward conversation from 3 years ago? Your brain essentially fights you. The simple task feels physically painful, almost impossible to initiate, because it requires you to manually override your brain's natural, highly active default state. And, this creates a really vicious cycle of guilt and shame. Because you look around, right, and you see other people just navigating daily life with so much ease. You see people who just go to the store, buy a thing, and go home without having a mild internal crisis about it. And because you know you are smart and you know you are capable of doing incredibly difficult things, you just cannot understand why you keep dropping the ball on the easy stuff. You start to think, maybe I am just undisciplined. Maybe I am just making excuses. But the truth is, your brain is just fundamentally not optimized for mundane, repetitive choices. It is a specialized machine. Like, you would not use a Formula One race car to drive to the grocery store in heavy traffic, right? I mean, it would overheat, it would stall, it would perform terribly. That does not mean it is a bad car. It just means it is entirely in the wrong environment. Your mind works the exact same way. The reality is, the very traits that make you exceptional at solving the big things are the exact same traits that make you stumble on the small things. The high sensitivity to variables, the ability to project into the future, the deep desire for optimal outcomes, these are all incredible cognitive gifts, but they are heavy. They require a ton of processing power. When you force your brain to use that heavy, high-powered machinery to decide what kind of takeout to order, you are creating massive cognitive friction. You are asking a visionary system to do administrative work, and honestly, the system is just going to crash. Recognizing this disconnect is the very first step to letting go of the guilt. It is about understanding that your struggle with daily choices is not a failure of character, but rather a direct byproduct of your cognitive strengths. So, the question then becomes, if this is just how your brain is wired, how on earth are you supposed to actually function in a world that requires you to make dozens of these small, mundane decisions every single day? Well, to figure out how to actually navigate this, we really need to look at how we can fundamentally change our environment rather than trying to change our actual brains. Because honestly, you are not going to rewire a highly analytical, maximizing brain to suddenly love the simplicity of picking a brand of paper towels. I mean, it is just not going to happen, right? The machinery is already built, and it is built for complexity. So the goal here is not to fix yourself, because, you are not actually broken in the first place. The real goal is to build external systems that basically protect your limited cognitive energy from being completely drained by the mundane, boring stuff. Think of it like putting bumpers on a bowling alley lane. You want to set up your life in a way where the small decisions are essentially made for you before you even have to think about them. And the most effective way to do this is through radical, intentional automation. You basically have to start treating your daily, routine choices with a ruthless level of efficiency, almost like you are a strict manager auditing a business. I mean, look at some of the most prolific thinkers, artists, and leaders throughout history. They almost always had daily routines that seemed incredibly boring to the outside world. They wore the exact same clothes, they ate the exact same breakfast, they followed the exact same schedule every single day. And, well, they did not do this because they lacked imagination, right? They did it because they wanted to hoard their cognitive energy for the things that actually mattered to them. So you have to start doing this in your own life immediately. Identify the daily choices that paralyze you the most. Is it what to eat for lunch? Is it what to wear to the office? Is it figuring out your evening workout routine? Honestly, pick those specific things and standardize them completely. Just create a default menu for your week. Buy 5 identical versions of a shirt that you like and that fits well. If it is a Tuesday, you are eating tacos. You do not even have to think about it. By removing the variable of choice entirely, you are literally giving your brain a much-needed break, and it is going to thank you for it. But, you cannot automate absolutely everything. Sometimes you actually have to make a choice in the moment, and that is exactly where you have to consciously practice shifting from a maximizing mindset to a satisficing mindset. This is honestly one of the hardest things for a gifted mind to do because it feels a lot like settling, and like your brain absolutely hates settling. But you have to teach yourself to establish a firm criteria for what is good enough. Before you go to buy a new blender or pick a hotel for a weekend trip, I want you to write down exactly 3 things that you actually need this thing to do. Not 10 things, just 3. Once you find an option that hits those 3 basic requirements, you have to force yourself to buy it and walk away. I mean, you literally have to cut off the research process right there. It is going to feel incredibly uncomfortable at first. Your brain is going to scream at you that there might be a better deal out there, or, a product with 1 extra feature. But you have to remind yourself that the time and energy you save is infinitely more valuable than that potential tiny optimization. And speaking of time, setting incredibly strict time limits for mundane decisions is absolutely crucial here. Because, Parkinson's law states that work expands to fill the time available for its completion, and if you give a highly analytical mind all day to decide what kind of couch to buy, it will, without a doubt, take all day. It will turn it into a massive thesis project, right? So you have to put yourself on a strict clock. If someone asks you where you want to go for dinner, give yourself literally 60 seconds to answer. If you are picking a movie on a streaming service, give yourself a maximum of 5 minutes. Set a timer on your phone if you have to. When the timer goes off, whatever you are currently looking at, that is what you choose. No looking back, no second guessing. Honestly, it trains your brain to realize that not every decision requires a deep dive analysis. You start to learn that, making a suboptimal choice about a pizza topping is not actually going to ruin your life. Another really great strategy, and I know this sounds a little silly, but it honestly works so well, is to literally externalize the decision. Just outsource it completely. If you are stuck between 2 perfectly fine options, like, let us say, 2 different paint colors for your hallway, or 2 different brands of sneakers, just flip a coin. I mean it. Because here is the secret about the coin toss. It is not actually about letting random chance run your life. It is about a psychological trick. While that coin is up in the air, your brain will almost always suddenly root for one of the outcomes. You will think, oh, please let it be heads. And in that split second, you suddenly know what you actually want without having to overanalyze it. And even if you do not have that sudden realization, just follow the coin anyway. Let the universe take the hit for the decision. It removes the heavy burden of responsibility from your own cognitive load, which honestly is the exact thing that is exhausting you in the first place. Now, when it comes to the execution of simple, boring tasks, like folding laundry or doing the dishes, you have to figure out how to hack your default mode network, which we talked about earlier. Remember, your brain fundamentally hates low stimulation environments. So you have to artificially raise the stimulation level of the environment so your brain does not completely rebel and shut down. You do this by pairing the completely mindless task with a highly engaging, cognitively stimulating activity. Do not just fold your laundry in silence. Listen to a complex podcast about astrophysics, or an audiobook on philosophy, or, learn a new language while you are scrubbing the floors. Give the highly active, demanding part of your brain a shiny toy to play with so that the physical body can just go on autopilot and get the mundane chores done. It is essentially about distracting the inner genius so the inner janitor can actually get some necessary work done without being constantly interrupted and critiqued. You also really need to start paying attention to the natural rhythm of your cognitive energy throughout the day. A lot of people try to force themselves to do their boring admin work or their simple chores right when they wake up, thinking they need to just get it out of the way, right? But if you are a complex problem solver, your morning, or whenever your peak energy hours happen to be, is when your cognitive battery is fully charged. That is your prime real estate. You should not be wasting that incredibly valuable, high-octane energy on picking out a pair of socks or replying to a simple text message. Save those mundane choices for the very end of the day, when your battery is basically in the red anyway. When you are tired, your brain actually does not have the energy to overcomplicate things. It literally cannot run the maximizing program because it is simply too exhausted. So, you will actually find it much easier to just make a simple choice and move on when you are operating on a low battery. But beyond all these tactical strategies and life hacks, the absolute most important shift has to happen internally. You have to genuinely work on releasing the intense guilt and the shame that comes with this paradox. Society puts a massive premium on the idea of being perfectly put together, right? We are constantly bombarded with messages suggesting that if you cannot keep your house perfectly organized, or if you struggle to meal prep every Sunday, you are somehow failing at being a responsible adult. But you have to realize that neurodiversity and just having a different cognitive profile means that your strengths and weaknesses are not going to look like the standard average template. You are built for deep work, for innovation, for crisis management, and for seeing the things that absolutely no one else sees. That is an incredible, profound gift to have in this world. And honestly, every single gift comes with a tax. Your tax is simply that the mundane stuff is hard, and that is okay. You do not need to be perfectly optimized in every single area of your human existence. If you occasionally eat cereal for dinner because you could not decide on a meal, or if you wear mismatched socks because the laundry was just too overwhelming that week, it really does not invalidate your brilliance. The world needs people who can solve the massive, terrifying problems, even if those same people get a little lost in the grocery store aisle. So, give yourself some grace, set up your external systems to protect your energy, and just embrace the beautifully complex, brilliantly chaotic mind that you have. Because, well, at the end of the day, it really is a superpower, as long as you learn how to properly manage the kryptonite. You are about to step into a major job interview, take a massive final exam, or maybe even go on a first date with someone you really like. Instead of visualizing yourself succeeding, your brain instantly decides to play a high-definition, unskippable movie of you completely ruining everything. You trip over your own feet, you forget your own name, you spill coffee all over the interviewer, or you just freeze up completely. If this sounds exactly like your inner monologue, well, you aren't actually doomed to fail, and you aren't just a hopeless cynic. You are actually using a highly effective, deeply misunderstood psychological strategy called defensive pessimism. I mean, let's be honest for a second. We live in a world that is absolutely obsessed with toxic positivity. Everywhere you look, whether it is on Instagram, self-help bookshelves, or just advice from well-meaning friends, the message is always the same. Just think positive, or good vibes only. We are constantly told that if we just manifest success and visualize ourselves crossing the finish line, everything will magically work out. But actually, for a huge chunk of the population, visualizing success does not make them feel better at all. In fact, it makes them feel incredibly anxious. If you are an overanalyzer, being told to just relax and expect the best is, quite frankly, terrifying. It feels like you are walking a tightrope without a net. So, what does your brain do instead? It secretly comforts itself by doing the exact opposite. It expects the absolute worst. To really understand what is going on here, we have to talk about what defensive pessimism actually is. Coined in the 1980s by psychologist Julie Norham, defensive pessimism isn't about being depressed or universally negative about life. It is basically a cognitive strategy used primarily by people who struggle with anxiety to manage their fears and actually get things done. You see, when you are a defensive pessimist, you deliberately set your expectations drastically low. You imagine all the ways a situation could go horribly wrong. But, and this is the absolute key difference, you don't just stop there and give up. You use that worst-case scenario as a blueprint to prepare. Let's really break down the mechanics of this, because it is actually brilliant when you think about it. Imagine you are throwing a big dinner party. A purely optimistic person might just say, "Oh, it's going to be great. Everyone will love the food. The vibe will be perfect. I'm not going to stress." And that is fine for them, right? But if a defensive pessimist tries to adopt that mindset, their underlying anxiety starts screaming, "But what if the oven breaks? What if Sarah is suddenly allergic to gluten? What if nobody talks to each other?" The anxiety doesn't just go away because you slapped a good vibes sticker over it. So the defensive pessimist leans into the anxiety. They mentally simulate the disaster, and then they buy a backup dessert. They make sure they have gluten-free options in the pantry, and they prepare a few conversational icebreakers just in case the room goes dead silent. By the time the dinner party actually happens, they have practically engineered a safety net for every possible disaster. And because they have done that, they can finally relax. Well, mostly relax anyway. You know what I mean? The act of overanalyzing the worst possible outcomes is exactly what gave them the comfort and the control they needed to actually function and succeed. The pessimism was defensive. It was a shield against the paralyzing effects of their own anxiety. It is really important, though, to distinguish this from what psychologists call dispositional pessimism. A dispositional pessimist is someone who genuinely believes that the world is a bad place, that things will inevitably go wrong, and that there is absolutely nothing they can do to change it. Their pessimism leads to fatalism. They might think, "Well, I'm going to fail that test anyway, so why even bother studying?" They just surrender to the negative outcome. Defensive pessimism, on the other hand, is completely action-oriented. It is a highly active, practically athletic mental process. The defensive pessimist sees, "I am probably going to fail this test because it is going to be impossibly hard, so I need to study for 12 hours, make 5 sets of flashcards, and hire a tutor just so I don't completely humiliate myself." Actually, studies have consistently shown that if you try to force a defensive pessimist to be optimistic, their performance severely drops. I know it sounds completely backward, right? But researchers have done experiments where they take people who naturally use defensive pessimism and they basically force them into a positive thinking exercise before a task. They tell them to listen to uplifting music, to visualize a perfect score, to just relax. And you know what happens? They perform significantly worse on puzzles, math tests, and dart-throwing exercises than they do when they are just allowed to sit there and worry. Why does that happen? Well, it is because, for these individuals, anxiety is the engine that drives their motivation. If you take away their ability to worry, you strip away their primary coping mechanism. You leave them with all the raw, unfocused adrenaline of anxiety. but without the strategic roadmap that pessimism usually provides them, without the worst-case scenario to plan against, they just feel exposed. It is kind of like taking away a highly trained knight's armor right before a battle and telling them, just think positively about the swords, you'll be fine. I mean, obviously, they are going to panic. When you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, this over-analyzing worst-case scenario mindset actually makes perfect sense. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, the early humans who survived weren't necessarily the ones chilling by the fire, optimistically assuming that the rustling in the bushes was just the wind. The ones who survived were the anxious overthinkers who assumed the rustling was a saber-toothed tiger and immediately started planning an escape route. Our brains are hardwired with the negativity bias because, historically speaking, ignoring a threat could be fatal, whereas ignoring a positive opportunity just meant you missed out on a snack. So, when your brain defaults to defensive pessimism, it is essentially just running ancient survival software in a modern, corporate, or social environment. But of course, modern society really struggles to validate this approach. We treat over-analyzing like it is a disease that needs to be cured with meditation apps and gratitude journals. And don't get me wrong, those things are genuinely great and helpful for a lot of people. But for the defensive pessimist, it can feel incredibly alienating. You start to feel like there is something fundamentally broken about you because you can't just let go and trust the process. You know, you hear people say things like, worrying means you suffer twice. And you just think, yeah, but if I don't worry the first time, I won't be prepared for the actual suffering. There is a profound, almost secret comfort in lowering the bar. When you expect the worst, reality almost always turns out to be a pleasant surprise. If you go into a performance review at work fully mentally prepared to be fired, and instead your boss just says, "Hey, you're doing a pretty good job, but try to answer emails a little faster," the sheer wave of relief you experience is intoxicating. You walk out of that office feeling like you just won the lottery. If you had gone in expecting a massive raise and a promotion and you got that exact same feedback, you would walk out feeling crushed and disappointed. By managing your expectations so aggressively downward, you are essentially protecting your future emotional state. You are padding the walls of your own mind. And honestly, the over-analyzing part is just how intelligent, detail-oriented brains process complex, unpredictable environments. When you care deeply about an outcome, whether it is your career, your relationships, or your personal art, your brain treats it as high stakes. And when the stakes are high, the brain craves data. It wants to map out every single variable. That is what the over-analyzing really is. It is data collection. Your mind is running hundreds of complex simulations per minute. If I say this, they might react like that. If I wear this, it might give off this impression. To an outside observer, it looks like you are just torturing yourself with neuroticism. But internally, you are basically doing what a supercomputer does before launching a rocket into space. You are calculating the trajectory of potential failure so that you can actively avoid it. It really changes how you view yourself once you realize that your anxiety isn't a flaw, but rather a tool that you have subconsciously weaponized to help you succeed. It reframes the whole narrative. You aren't a broken optimist. You are a strategic pessimist. You aren't self-sabotaging. You are self-protecting. And I think, once we start to actually accept that some people just operate better when they are a little bit stressed and a little bit doubtful, we can stop forcing everyone into this one-size-fits-all mold of bubbly cheerfulness. Because the truth is, the world actually needs both types of people. We absolutely need the wild optimists who blindly leap into the unknown and dream up massive, impossible ideas without worrying about the logistics. But we also desperately need the defensive pessimists. We need the overanalyzers who look at those massive ideas and say, okay, that sounds amazing, but here are the 17 ways this could instantly burst into flames, and here is how we are going to prevent that from happening. Without defensive pessimists, bridges would collapse, rockets would explode, and dinner parties would definitely run out of appetizers. So, the next time your brain starts feeding you that familiar reel of disaster scenarios, maybe just take a breath and thank it. It is just doing its job, trying to keep you safe in a chaotic world. So, while we have established that this whole mental process is basically a hidden superpower, I think we also need to have a really honest conversation about the hidden costs. Because, let's be totally real for a second. Running all of these worst-case scenario simulations in your head all day long is incredibly exhausting. Your brain is essentially operating like a smartphone that has 75 different apps open in the background, constantly refreshing and draining the battery. Even though defensive pessimism is highly productive and it absolutely gets you to the finish line safely, you are still carrying the heavy emotional weight of that anxiety. To your body, stress is just stress. And if you are constantly living in that hypervigilant, problem-solving state, you are basically marinating your brain in cortisol, which can very quickly lead to severe burnout if you aren't careful. This brings us to a really crucial point, which is learning how to actually manage this trait so that it doesn't completely consume your entire life. Like, how do you use the tool without letting the tool use you? The absolute key here, basically, is to learn the difference between productive worrying and toxic rumination. Productive worrying is what we talked about earlier. It has a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. You think of a potential disaster, you create a concrete plan to avoid it, and then you put that plan into action. Rumination, on the other hand, is when your brain just gets stuck. You are just replaying the exact same negative thought over and over again without actually generating any new solutions. You are just obsessing over the fact that you might fail without doing any actual prep work. When you catch yourself ruminating, that is the exact moment you must intervene. One genuinely effective way to interrupt that loop, and I know this is going to sound a little bit ridiculous at first, is to schedule what psychologists call worry time. It sounds silly, right? But it actually works wonders for overanalyzers. Basically, you give yourself a strict, dedicated 15-minute window every single day to just completely freak out. You sit down with a notebook and you just let your mind go down every single dark, catastrophic rabbit hole it wants to. You write down every irrational fear and every little thing that could possibly go wrong. But, and this is the important part, once that timer goes off, you have to close the notebook and walk away. If a massive anxious thought pops into your head later in the day, you just tell yourself, actually, I don't have time to worry about this right now. I will save it for my worry time tomorrow. It sounds simple, but it gives your brain the validation it absolutely craves while containing the anxiety. And, managing your own mind is really only half the battle because eventually you have to interact with other people. This is where things can get really complicated for the defensive pessimist. Chances are you either work with, are friends with, or are even romantically involved with a relentless optimist. And man, that dynamic can cause a lot of friction. To the optimist, your constant need to point out potential flaws feels like you are just raining on their parade. They feel like you are dragging their energy down, but to you, their blind optimism feels genuinely dangerous. You look at them and think, how can you possibly be this relaxed? You are ignoring all the glaringly obvious risks. It is basically a massive clash of coping mechanisms. They cope by assuming things will be fine, and you cope by assuming things will fall apart. Neither of you is inherently wrong, but if you don't actually communicate, you will just resent each other. So, how do you bridge that gap? You really have to explain the mechanics of your brain to the optimists in your life. You have to tell them, like, hey, I am not pointing out these problems because I want to be negative. I am pointing them out because finding the flaws is how I feel safe. It is how I ensure that we actually succeed. Once people realize that your pessimism isn't a weapon being used against them, but rather a protective shield, their entire perspective usually shifts. They stop seeing you as a buzzkill and start seeing you as the incredibly valuable safety net that you actually are. I mean, every visionary optimist who wants to launch a startup absolutely needs a grounded, defensive pessimist by their side to read the fine print, pack the emergency kit, and make sure they don't accidentally bankrupt themselves. It is a highly complementary relationship if you just learn to respect the differences. But there is another secret companion that almost always tags along with defensive pessimism, and we really need to shine a light on it. I am talking about imposter syndrome. I mean, think about it. If your entire strategy relies on constantly telling yourself that you are probably going to fail, it becomes incredibly difficult to internalize your own successes. When you inevitably ace that exam or pull off that flawless project, your brain doesn't just naturally say, wow, I am actually really talented. Instead, your brain says, wow, I completely dodged a bullet there. The only reason I didn't fail is because I stressed myself out to the absolute brink. You basically end up attributing all of your success to your anxiety rather than to your actual competence. You start to believe that the worrying is the magic ingredient, and if you ever stop worrying, you will instantly be exposed as a complete fraud. Breaking that specific psychological loop is probably the hardest challenge a defensive pessimist will ever face. You have to start actively retraining your brain to recognize your own skill. The next time you succeed at something, instead of just breathing a massive sigh of relief and moving on to the next crisis, you really need to force yourself to pause. You have to look at the result and say, actually, I did that because I am highly capable. My preparation was a skill. My attention to detail was a talent. You have to slowly untangle your identity from your anxiety. It is totally fine to use defensive pessimism as a tool, but you cannot let it become the only reason you think you are worthy of success. You have to realize that you are the one steering the ship, not the storm clouds that you are predicting. It takes a lot of practice, but it is absolutely essential. And finally, I think we have to talk about the joy of anticipation, or rather, the complete lack of it. When you are always bracing for impact, when you are always padding the walls of your mind against disappointment, you unfortunately rob yourself of the simple, pure joy of looking forward to things. Like, if you are going on a vacation, a normal person gets to enjoy weeks of daydreaming about the beach. But if you are a defensive pessimist, you spend those weeks worrying about lost luggage and hurricane weather. You miss out on the pre-vacation high because you are too busy building mental life rafts. While managing expectations is definitely a great way to protect yourself from pain, it also completely dilutes your happiness. You end up living in this sort of emotionally numb middle ground where you are never completely devastated, but you are also never truly, wildly excited either. Have you ever caught yourself saying, well, I think I'm just feeling a bit overwhelmed because of this, that, and the other, and then immediately moving on as if just naming the problem somehow miraculously solved it? You see, you aren't actually feeling your feelings. You are just thinking about them, and honestly, there is a massive difference between the two. We live in a world that, absolutely idolizes logic. We're taught from a very young age that to be emotional is to be messy, to be out of control, or worse, to be weak. So naturally, we adapt. We develop this incredibly sophisticated defense mechanism called intellectualization. I mean, it sounds smart, right? It sounds productive, but in reality, it's just a trap. It is the trap of emotional logic, and it is quietly keeping you completely disconnected from your true self. So let's just take a step back and really look at what intellectualization actually is. In psychology, it's defined as a defense mechanism where reasoning is used to block confrontation with an unconscious conflict and its associated emotional stress. But in plain English, it's basically when you retreat into your head to avoid what's happening in your heart or, your physical body. Imagine you go through a really painful breakup. Instead of allowing yourself to just sit on the couch, eat ice cream, and cry because you are heartbroken, you immediately start analyzing the relationship. You start saying things like, well, fundamentally, our attachment styles were incompatible. Or, it makes sense we ended things because our 5-year trajectories didn't align. You are using big words to build a fortress around your pain. You think you're processing it, but you're just filing it away. And the tricky thing about this, the really insidious part, is that it feels like you are doing the hard work. Like you might even go to therapy and spend the entire 50 minutes giving your therapist a highly detailed clinical breakdown of your childhood trauma. You understand the why behind everything. You can map out exactly how your parents' emotional unavailability led to your current avoidance issues. You know the terminology, you've read the psychology books, and you understand the frameworks. But when you talk about it, your voice is completely flat. There are no tears, there is no anger, there is no actual bodily sensation of release. You have effectively become a journalist reporting on your own life rather than the person actually living it. You've traded emotional resolution for intellectual understanding and, well, unfortunately, the brain simply cannot think its way out of a feeling. Why do we do this though? It's not like we wake up one day and decide, hey, I'm going to completely sever the connection between my mind and my body. It is a profound survival strategy. For many of us, this habit starts in childhood. Maybe you grew up in a household where strong emotions simply weren't allowed or tolerated. If you got angry, you were punished. If you cried, you were told to, suck it up, or given something to actually cry about. Or perhaps you grew up in a chaotic environment where the adults around you were so emotionally unpredictable that you had to become the logical anchor. You learned very early on that feelings were dangerous, unpredictable, and unsafe. Logic, on the other hand, logic was safe. Logic was controllable. Logic had rules. So, you built a mental sanctuary out of rationality, and you've been hiding in it ever since. And society absolutely praises this, by the way. Think about the people we admire in our modern culture. We praise the stoic leader, the unflappable CEO, the person who stays completely cool under intense pressure. We reward people who can expertly compartmentalize their feelings and just push through whatever crisis is in front of them. So, when you intellectualize your pain, you aren't just protecting yourself. You are often getting externally validated for it. People will tell you how strong you are, how incredibly self-aware you are, how maturely you handled that terrible situation. But this validation is basically a double-edged sword. It reinforces the idea that your worth is somehow tied to your ability to suppress your humanity. It tells you that as long as you can analyze the bleeding wound, you don't actually have to bandage it. But, the wound is still there, quietly waiting for attention. This brings us to the profound cost of living entirely from the neck up. When you intellectualize your emotions, you create a massive disconnect between your mind and your physical body. Emotions aren't just abstract thoughts floating around in the ether of your brain. They are very real physiological events. I mean, think about it. When you are scared, your heart literally races, your palms sweat, your stomach drops. When you are angry, your jaw clenches, your chest tightens, your blood pressure spikes. The word emotion essentially means energy in motion. It is a physical experience that needs to complete a biological cycle in your body. But when you try to intercept that physical experience with cold, calculated logic, you stop the cycle midway. You trap that energy inside your physical form with absolutely nowhere to go. So, what happens to all those unfelt feelings? They don't just vanish simply because you manage to articulate a really smart thesis about them. No, they set up camp in your body. This is where we start seeing the physical manifestations of suppressed emotions. It shows up as chronic tension in your shoulders, unexplained back pain, tension headaches, digestive issues, or a constant low-grade thrum of anxiety that never quite goes away. Your mind is sitting up there saying, well, I've processed this logically, so we are completely fine. But your nervous system is screaming, we are absolutely not fine, and I am holding on to all this stress until you finally pay attention. It's like trying to put out a massive house fire by simply explaining the chemical composition of flames to the firefighters. It's intellectually interesting, sure, but the house is still burning down, you know? Furthermore, this constant state of intellectualization completely robs you of genuine connection, both with yourself and with other people. When you can't drop into your own emotional experience, you become a detached observer of your own life. You might feel a chronic sense of emptiness, a lingering feeling of being numb or disconnected, even when really good things happen. Because, and this is the really cruel irony of emotional suppression, you cannot selectively numb emotion. If you numb the pain, the grief, the anger, and the sadness through relentless logic, you invariably numb the joy, the excitement, the passion, and the love. You flatten the entire vibrant landscape of your emotional life into a gray, featureless plane of pure rationality. It keeps you safe from the extreme lows, but it completely locks you out of the incredible highs that make life actually worth living. And it really impacts your relationships too. Like, have you ever tried to comfort someone who is deeply upset by offering them a purely logical solution? It almost always makes them feel worse. Why? Because logic does not foster intimacy, vulnerability does. When you are always the fixer, the analyzer, the one who remains perfectly objective and detached, you unknowingly build a massive wall between yourself and the people you love. They might admire your intellect, but they really can't feel your heart. True intimacy requires you to step out from behind the fortress of your logic and allow yourself to be seen in all your messy, irrational, deeply feeling humanity. But if you are secretly terrified of your own emotions, allowing someone else to witness them feels like, well, an absolute impossibility. It takes immense bravery to drop the armor of intellect and just simply be human. So, once you finally recognize that you have been doing this, once you see the absolute fortress of logic that you have built around your heart, the most natural next question is, well, how do I actually stop? I mean, how do you bridge that massive, seemingly impossible gap between knowing that you are sad and actually allowing yourself to feel the sadness? It is incredibly daunting, especially if you have spent, decades perfecting the art of intellectual evasion. But the truth is, moving from your head into your body is not some mystical, unachievable feat. It is a biological process. It is a practice, and like any practice, it feels incredibly clunky, awkward, and frankly, completely unsafe when you first start doing it. Because remember, your brain has categorized feeling your emotions as a literal threat to your survival. The very first step, and honestly, this is probably the hardest part, is learning how to drop the narrative. When we intellectualize, we are absolutely obsessed with the storyline. We are fixated on the why. Why did they say that? Why am I reacting this way? What is the root cause of this specific trigger? We essentially become detectives at the scene of our own emotional crimes. But to actually feel a feeling, you have to, at least temporarily, entirely abandon the story. You have to strip away all the context, all the history, and all the justifications, and just look at the raw data of what is happening in the present moment. I mean, think about it like this. If you accidentally touch a hot stove, you don't stand there theorizing about the thermodynamic properties of the metal or analyzing why you were careless enough to put your hand there. No, you just feel the burn, right? You pull your hand back. Emotional pain needs to be treated the exact same way. So when you notice yourself getting triggered and you feel that familiar urge to start analyzing and diagnosing the situation, I want you to try and gently pause. Just, stop the mental spin cycle. Instead of asking yourself, why am I feeling this? I want you to ask yourself a completely different question. Where am I feeling this in my physical body? I mean, literally, close your eyes and do a scan. Is there a sudden tightness gripping your chest? Does your throat feel like it is closing up? Is there a heavy, sinking sensation in the absolute pit of your stomach? Are your shoulders creeping all the way up to your ears? This is called somatic tracking, and it is profoundly powerful. It takes you out of the abstract, swirling chaos of your mind and violently, beautifully drops you right into the undeniable reality of your physical vessel. And once you locate that physical sensation, your only job is to just sit with it. Now, I know that sounds incredibly simple, but I also know it is terrifying. Your instinct is going to be to run away, to fix it, to numb it, or to quickly rationalize it away. You will literally feel your brain desperately trying to hand you a neatly packaged intellectual thesis to distract you from the discomfort. But, just kindly tell your brain, not right now, we are just going to sit here. Imagine that the physical sensation is a small, frightened child sitting in the room with you. You wouldn't throw a psychology textbook at a crying child, would you? No, you would just sit next to them. You would breathe with them. You would just simply keep them company while they ride out the storm. This brings us to a really fascinating piece of neuroscience that I think actually helps logic-minded people transition into feeling. There is this concept introduced by Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, a Harvard-trained neuroanatomist, called the 90-second rule. She discovered that when a person has a reaction to something in their environment, there is a 90-second chemical process that happens in the body. From the moment the trigger happens, to the chemicals flooding your bloodstream, to them completely flushing out of your system, it takes exactly 1.5 minutes. That's it. 90 seconds. If you are still feeling angry or sad or anxious after those 90 seconds have passed, it is not because the initial emotion is still happening. It is because your thoughts, your intellectualizing, your constant ruminating on the story are re-triggering the chemical dump over and over again. You are literally keeping the emotion artificially alive with your logic. So, when you drop the story and just focus entirely on the physical sensation, the tightness, the heat, the pressure, you only really have to endure the peak of it for about 90 seconds. I mean, you can survive anything for 1.5 minutes, right? When you don't feed the emotion with a story, it crests like a wave, it breaks, and then it rolls back out to sea. It doesn't consume you. It doesn't destroy you, it just moves through you, and the physical relief that follows that wave is something you can never ever achieve by simply analyzing the problem. It is an actual biological discharge of stress energy that resets your nervous system. You will literally feel your muscles let go. You will take a deeper breath than you have taken in weeks. But let's be completely honest here. The transition period is going to be incredibly messy. As you start thawing out this frozen emotional landscape, things are going to get weird. You might find yourself crying over a dropped spoon in the kitchen, or feeling a sudden, intense burst of anger while you are just driving to the grocery store. This is completely normal. I mean, you have a massive backlog of unprocessed emotional energy sitting in your system, and once you finally open the valve, it is not going to come out in perfectly organized, socially acceptable little droplets. It is going to be a bit chaotic. You have to give yourself the grace and the absolute permission to be messy. You have to let go of the idea that you always need to look perfectly put together and fully in control, because honestly, control is precisely what got you stuck in the first place. You also have to relearn how to physically express these things. For years, you have contained your feelings by trapping them in your head. Now, you have to let them out through your physical form. If you are angry, well, maybe you need to go into your car, roll up the windows, and just scream at the top of your lungs. Or maybe you need to punch a pillow or do a really intense, heavy workout. If you are grieving, you need to let your body sob. I mean, the ugly, snot-nosed, chest-heaving kind of sobbing where you don't try to make it look pretty or wipe the tears away before they even fall. Have you ever watched an animal that just survived a predator attack? Once they are safe, they literally shake violently for a few minutes. They are physically trembling to discharge the trauma energy from their nervous system. We are animals too. We need to move, to shake, to make noise, to actually physically process our experiences. During this whole journey, self-compassion is absolutely non-negotiable. You are going to catch yourself slipping back into intellectualization all the time. You will be right in the middle of a beautiful, messy cry, and suddenly your brain will say, well, actually, Freud would argue that this is just displaced aggression. When that happens, and it absolutely will, do not beat yourself up. Don't get angry at your defense mechanisms. I mean, you have to realize that this intellectual armor kept you safe when you desperately needed to be safe. It was a brilliant, incredibly effective survival strategy that served you well for a very long time. So when it shows up, just kind of smile at it. Thank it for trying to protect you. And then gently say, I appreciate you looking out for me, but I am safe enough to actually feel this now. And the ripple effect this will have on your life is just, well, it's nothing short of breathtaking. When you start living in your body, your relationships will transform in ways you probably can't even imagine right now. You will no longer be the detached, purely logical observer standing on the sidelines of your own life, offering sterile advice to the people you love. You will be in the arena with them by allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to be messy, to be visibly moved by things. You subconsciously give everyone around you the permission to do the absolute same. True connection doesn't happen when two people perfectly analyze a situation together. It happens when two people are brave enough to sit in the uncomfortable, unspoken resonance of shared feeling. You become a safer place for other people when you are finally a safe place for yourself. But perhaps the most magnificent payoff of all is the return of genuine, unfiltered joy. Remember how we talked about the fact that you cannot selectively numb your emotions? Well, the exact same principle applies in reverse. As you slowly chip away at the intellectual dam, holding back your pain and your sadness, you also open the floodgates for the good stuff. I mean, the colors of the world literally become brighter. You start to feel the kind of deep, belly-laughing joy that you maybe haven't felt since you were a little kid. You feel genuine awe, unbridled passion, and a profound, thrumming sense of aliveness in your everyday existence. It is like finally seeing the world in full color after years of just staring at a black and white spreadsheet. So, the next time you feel a wave of emotion coming on, I challenge you to do something completely radical. Don't analyze it. Don't explain it. Don't organize it into a neat little psychological category. Just put your hand on your heart, take a deep breath, and let it wash over you. Let yourself be entirely, beautifully human. It is absolutely terrifying at first. I won't lie to you. But on the other side of that terror is the very freedom, the very life that you have been endlessly searching for in all of your logic. Stop trying to outsmart your own heart. It's time to finally let yourself feel. You finally get exactly what you want. The healthy relationship, the dream job, a moment of actual genuine peace. And what do? You burn it entirely to the ground. You do not do it on purpose, not consciously anyway, but you always find a way to break it. Why? Because for a deep thinker, happiness is actually terrifying and predictable chaos. Well, predictable chaos actually feels intimately like home. Let us be completely honest here for a second. It is not that you do not genuinely want good things to happen to you in your life. You probably spend hours, literally hours, lying awake at night just daydreaming about having absolute peace, emotional stability, and lasting success. But when that exact reality actually shows up at your front door, your nervous system immediately sounds the alarm. It is like suddenly this unfamiliar quiet feels deeply and fundamentally like a trap. You start frantically looking everywhere for the catch. And when you cannot easily find one, when everything in your life is actually just completely fine, you unconsciously create one. You start the completely petty, unnecessary argument. You deliberately procrastinate on the big, life-changing project. You slowly, quietly pull away from the amazing person who actually, genuinely loves you. To really understand this deeply frustrating cycle, we actually have to take a hard look at how your brain is fundamentally wired. You see, the human brain is not primarily designed to make you happy. I know that sounds a bit cynical, maybe even a bit depressing, but it is just basic neurobiological truth. Your brain is exclusively designed to do one single thing: keep you alive. And how exactly does it do that? By heavily, obsessively prioritizing the familiar over absolutely everything else. If you unfortunately grew up in a very chaotic environment, or if you have just spent years, constantly putting out massive emotional fires in your own adult life, your nervous system entirely adapts to that chaotic, stressful baseline. Chronic stress simply becomes your normal everyday weather. Spikes of adrenaline become your baseline operating frequency. So, when things are suddenly incredibly calm, quiet, and good, your brain does not actually register that as safety or profound relief. It registers it as a massive, terrifying void, a deeply disturbing lack of incoming sensory data. And to an overactive, highly intelligent mind, a sudden lack of data usually means that extreme danger is definitely lurking just out of sight, quietly preparing to ambush you when you least expect it. This is exactly where being a deep thinker actually works entirely against you. People who constantly overanalyze, who feel things incredibly intensely. We just have this profound, almost artistic ability to connect imaginary dots that aren't even there in reality. When life is going surprisingly, beautifully well, an average person might just take a deep breath and say, "Hey, this is really great. I am just going to peacefully enjoy this wonderful moment." But definitely not you. No, you sit there in the uncomfortable quiet and think, okay, well, when exactly is the other shoe going to drop? because in your heavily lived past experience, the other shoe always, inevitably, violently dropped. You have essentially learned to rigidly, permanently associate temporary peace with the deceptive, eerie calm right before a massive destructive storm. It is like you are standing alone in a beautiful, sunny, idyllic green field. But instead of just peacefully feeling the warm sunshine on your face, you are just anxiously, obsessively scanning the distant horizon for a violent, destructive tornado that you are absolutely, unequivocally convinced is aggressively coming for you. And this predictably brings us to the absolute core of the entire self-sabotage mechanism, which is control. This is a huge, massive one, actually, maybe the single biggest underlying factor of them all. When you destroy the perfectly good thing all by yourself, well, at least you are the one safely holding the match. Just genuinely think about it for a quick second. If you bravely let yourself be completely, unabashedly happy, if you truly lean into that beautiful, healthy relationship, or boldly embrace that amazing, terrifying career opportunity, you instantly become incredibly vulnerable. You are essentially taking a massive piece of your personal emotional safety and carelessly handing it over to the totally unpredictable, deeply chaotic nature of the universe. And for someone who thinks deeply, who rigorously maps out every single possible negative outcome, and who has probably been profoundly, deeply hurt before in life, that specific level of vulnerability is absolutely excruciating. It honestly feels exactly like walking a very high, very thin tightrope completely without a safety net. So, subconsciously, deep down in the hidden shadows of your mind, you make a desperate, protective choice. You actively, purposefully choose the deeply familiar pain of ruining it yourself over the sheer, paralyzing, unthinkable terror of it being taken away from you unexpectedly by someone or something else. Because of this specific, twisted dynamic, predictable chaos slowly becomes your ultimate, unshakable comfort zone. I mean, really think about the common phrase comfort zone for a minute. We usually casually think of it as this cozy, warm, completely safe, wonderful place, right? But psychologically speaking, a comfort zone is really just whatever specific conditions you are heavily, routinely used to. For a whole lot of highly perceptive, deeply thinking individuals, the so-called comfort zone is actually just a perpetual, exhausting state of high emotional alert. It is constantly worrying about money. It is endlessly analyzing a confusing, toxic social dynamic. It is chronically running on absolute fumes, just trying to frantically survive the day. When you are right in the dead, messy middle of total chaos, you honestly know exactly what to do. You instantly, automatically become this incredibly competent, hyper-vigilant, amazing firefighter. Your brain instinctively knows every single line of that stressful survival script. But real happiness, genuine, lasting, boring peace, well, that is totally unscripted, terrifyingly uncharted territory. You honestly do not have a single clue who you really are when you aren't frantically fixing a major crisis or intensely surviving a personal disaster. Honestly, there is a very profound, completely unacknowledged identity crisis that happens to all of us when things finally, genuinely get good. If your entire personality, or at least how you fundamentally perceive yourself in the world, has been heavily built entirely around the brave narrative of overcoming intense, crushing adversity, who on earth are you when the adversity suddenly, unexpectedly stops? It is like, a very battle-hardened soldier finally coming back home from a very long, brutal war. The sudden, peaceful quiet of civilian life is completely, utterly deafening. You actually start to feel deeply, uncomfortably bored, but it is not actually normal boredom that you are experiencing. It is a literal, physical, physiological withdrawal from the heavy, addictive stress hormones, the daily cortisol, and the rushing adrenaline that your body has literally been running on for years and years. You tragically, mistakenly interpret the gentle, healthy absence of anxiety for a sad lack of passion or a depressing lack of personal importance. So, without even consciously realizing what you are actually doing, you unconsciously inject totally unnecessary, dramatic chaos right back into your daily life just to feel like you're normal yourself again. And the specific, quiet way we usually go about doing this is incredibly insidious, sneaky, and subtle. It is almost never some grand, dramatic, cinematic gesture where you dramatically burn your whole entire life down in one single day. Usually, it actually starts very quietly, very privately, by hyperfixating on incredibly small, totally insignificant human flaws. Let us just say you finally meet someone truly fantastic. They communicate openly, they genuinely care, they actually show up exactly when they say they will, which is incredibly rare. For the first few beautiful weeks, it is genuinely, purely great. But then that deep thinking, over-analytical, deeply terrified brain of yours kicks into extremely high gear. You start noticing that they laugh just a little too loudly at restaurants, or maybe they just do not happen to like the exact same obscure, weird indie movies that you absolutely love. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, these tiny, perfectly normal human details become massive, glaring, unforgivable red flags in your hypervigilant mind. You easily convince yourself that you are just being very smart, protecting your very high standards. But actually, you are just methodically, quietly building an airtight, logical case for exactly why this obviously won't work out, all so you can safely, quickly retreat back to your familiar, completely predictable loneliness. It really is the absolute ultimate, deeply tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. You fundamentally, completely expect the good thing to eventually fail, so you act in very subtle, highly destructive ways that absolutely, positively ensure it actually fails. Then, when it finally, inevitably falls apart completely, you casually look at the emotional rubble and firmly tell yourself, "See, I completely knew it. I was totally 100% right all along." And that specific sensation of being proven right actually gives you a very sick, very temporary sort of comforting satisfaction. I mean, it perfectly, neatly validates your deeply held, deeply cynical core belief that the world is inherently an unsafe place and that genuinely good things simply do not ever last for people exactly like you. But what you so very often fail to clearly realize in that fleeting, bitter moment of empty vindication is that you were the absolute sole architect of the entire structural failure. You foolishly, tragically traded a real, rare chance at genuine, lasting joy for the incredibly cheap, incredibly hollow, ultimately depressing comfort of just being right about your own inevitable doom. But if we are really truly going to dig down into the absolute bedrock of this entire self-sabotaging behavior, we have to deeply talk about the concept of core worthiness. You see, on a strictly conscious level, you obviously believe that you completely deserve to be happy. You work incredibly hard, you try desperately to be a fundamentally good person, and you put in a massive amount of effort into your own personal growth. But subconsciously, well, there is often a very different, much darker script silently running in the background. For a lot of deep, introspective thinkers, there is this profound, lingering, incredibly quiet suspicion that you are somehow fundamentally flawed. It is like a very deep-seated, deeply internalized imposter syndrome. But it is not just about your career or your daily work. It is literally about your absolute right to experience genuine joy. You honestly, secretly feel like a fraud when you are actually happy. When somebody genuinely loves you unconditionally, or when a massive, incredible life opportunity just effortlessly falls right into your lap, your immediate, knee-jerk internal reaction is not immense gratitude. It is profound, absolute guilt. You start actively questioning why on earth you, of all people, actually get to have this beautiful thing. You unconsciously convince yourself that if people really truly knew the complex, messy, heavily flawed person you are deep down inside, they would immediately take it all away. So basically, you just deliberately decide to reject it first, loudly, simply to beat them to the painful, inevitable punch. This incredibly frustrating phenomenon is actually something psychologists commonly refer to as hitting your personal upper limit. I mean, just imagine for a second that you actually have an invisible, deeply hidden internal thermostat located directly inside your mind. But instead of aggressively regulating the room temperature, it is strictly regulating your daily capacity for positive emotion. You have spent your entire life unconsciously programming this exact thermostat to comfortably hover around a very specific, totally manageable baseline of low-level stress and mild, predictable disappointment. So, what exactly happens when you suddenly get that massive, wonderful promotion, or when you finally experience true, genuine romantic intimacy? The emotional temperature in the room instantly skyrockets completely past your normal, familiar baseline setting. Your internal psychological machinery suddenly starts aggressively blaring warning sirens. It feels dangerously, unbearably hot in there. And because you literally, genuinely do not possess the necessary emotional tolerance to simply sit there and comfortably handle that profound level of intense, radiating joy, you instantly panic. You desperately, frantically reach out to rip the thermostat right off the wall, aggressively plunging the entire room back into the freezing, familiar darkness. You pick a massive, dramatic fight. You completely blow off a crucial, career-defining meeting. You drink way too much on a very important, delicate night out. You do absolutely whatever it desperately takes to aggressively lower that emotional temperature right back down to a miserable yet incredibly comfortable, highly familiar freezing point, because the brutal, bitter cold feels so incredibly, wonderfully safe to your deeply terrified mind. So, how on earth do you actually permanently stop doing this? How do you finally break this totally exhausting, deeply destructive cycle of constantly, repeatedly tearing down your own beautiful life? Well, the very first, absolutely crucial step is just recognizing the insidious, quiet mechanics of the cycle while it is literally actively happening right in front of your face. You honestly have to start treating your own highly active, profoundly suspicious mind with a very healthy dose of gentle, compassionate skepticism. The next time you find yourself entirely convinced that your totally amazing, incredibly supportive partner is secretly, definitely harboring some sinister, awful ulterior motive, or the very moment you start logically, meticulously convincing yourself that your wonderful, perfectly good dream job is actually a terrible, suffocating trap, you genuinely need to physically stop yourself. Just pause for one brief, incredibly powerful second. Take a very deep, very slow breath and honestly ask yourself a brutally real question. Is this actual, legitimate, factual reality right now? Or is this just my traumatized, highly anxious nervous system desperately, aggressively searching for an extremely familiar fire to extinguish? You essentially have to slowly, meticulously learn to actively distinguish the genuine, incredibly important voice of real, actual intuition from the loud, panicked, totally irrational screaming of deeply entrenched past trauma. Real intuition is generally very calm, incredibly clear, and profoundly steady. Trauma, on the other hand, is always incredibly urgent, massively dramatic, totally chaotic, and desperately loud, demanding you react and burn everything down right this precise second to somehow stay safe. And honestly, this ultimately brings us to the hardest, most incredibly uncomfortable part of the entire healing process. You literally have to start actively, deliberately practicing the terrifying art of simply tolerating joy. I know that sounds completely ridiculous, right? I mean, who actually needs to deeply practice feeling genuinely happy? But you do. You absolutely, fundamentally do. Because right now, real, genuine joy feels entirely like a profound threat to your physical nervous system. When the really good thing finally happens and that familiar, intense, highly sickening wave of deep panic inevitably starts quickly rising up in your throat, urging you to aggressively run away or aggressively destroy the moment, you simply have to forcefully command yourself to physically stay completely put. You do not defensively send that heavily passive-aggressive, angry text message. You definitely do not angrily, impulsively quit the really amazing, slightly challenging project. You literally just sit right there, right in the absolute dead center of that incredibly terrifying, profoundly unfamiliar goodness, and you deliberately, stubbornly refuse to move a single muscle. You have to bravely, quietly let your severely overactive, deeply stressed brain slowly, gently realize that the proverbial other shoe is not actually necessarily going to drop. You basically have to physically, mentally, and biologically endure the total, utterly excruciating boredom of absolute boring peace until it finally, slowly stops feeling like an impending, massive, catastrophic disaster and actually finally starts feeling comfortably, genuinely like your real, true, wonderfully permanent home, where you genuinely belong forever and always now, safely without any doubt. You also urgently, desperately need to start actively rewriting your deeply held, internal personal narrative right this very moment. If you honestly see yourself entirely as the tragic, deeply flawed hero who is just perpetually, hopelessly destined to heroically overcome constant, unending tragedy, you will just continually, subconsciously manufacture fresh new tragedies just to comfortably play out that highly familiar, dramatically comforting role. You seriously have to intentionally, consciously decide to completely let go of that specific, heavy, highly dramatic identity. You absolutely have to start actively visualizing a totally new, highly unfamiliar version of yourself. A deeply grounded, wonderfully calm version of you who actually genuinely thrives in sustained, quiet peace. You essentially have to fiercely mourn the absolute loss of your former chaotic, constantly struggling self, because honestly, letting go of the profound, intense drama is essentially letting go of a very massive, deeply ingrained part of who you fundamentally thought you were your entire life. Ultimately, you have profoundly, bravely survived more than enough chaos for one single, completely exhausting lifetime. You have meticulously, deeply analyzed absolutely every single terrible, awful, horrible thing that could realistically, potentially ever go wrong. Now, it is finally, genuinely time to bravely, boldly use that incredibly powerful, immensely deep thinking mind of yours to meticulously, vividly imagine everything that could actually, realistically, incredibly go totally right. It is finally time to bravely, entirely lay down your heavy, exhausting emotional armor and to bravely, fiercely let yourself actually, genuinely experience the absolute magic of being completely, totally, perfectly okay right now, forever.